Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. This is going to take a while, and that's entirely the point. The Simpsons has been running since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, the longest-running American animated series, the longest-running scripted primetime show in the entire history of television. And in all that time, something about this show has burrowed so deep into the cultural imagination that people who stopped watching it 20 years ago still find themselves thinking about it, quoting it, dreaming about Springfield the way you dream about a hometown you left behind. Tonight we're going deeper than the surface, past the jokes, past the gags, past the couch opening and the school bus, and the saxophone. We're going into the strange, layered, quietly unsettling world that exists underneath the yellow skin and the four fingers and the D.O. There are mysteries in Springfield that the show has never answered. There are theories so carefully constructed, so thoroughly supported by evidence buried across decades of episodes, that the writers themselves have been forced to acknowledge them publicly. There are connections between storylines that span entire seasons, waiting for someone patient enough to draw the lines. That's what we're doing tonight. 10 sections, each one going deeper than the last. By the time we're finished, you will never look at that opening couch gag quite the same way again. Let's begin. Section 1. The Springfield Nuclear Conspiracy. The plant that poisoned everything. There is a theory about The Simpsons that explains, in a single sentence, almost everything strange and wrong and impossible about Springfield. It explains why nobody ages. It explains why the town forgets catastrophic events. It explains Homer's superhuman ability to survive injuries that would kill anyone else. It explains the yellow skin, the four fingers, the bulging eyes, the physical impossibilities that the show presents as ordinary. The Springfield nuclear power plant is mutating the entire town. That sentence sounds simple. It sounds like a joke, the kind of offhand observation someone makes while half watching an episode at 2 in the morning. But the deeper you go into the canonical evidence, the more it stops sounding like a joke and starts sounding like something the show has been quietly, patiently telling you for over 3 decades. The evidence isn't hidden. It's in plain sight, spread across hundreds of episodes, dropped into scenes and then immediately buried under the next punchline. The show tells you what it's doing. It just trusts that you won't pay close enough attention to put it all together. So tonight we're paying attention. Let's start with what the show establishes as settled fact. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility owned entirely by Charles Montgomery Burns. It is the sole major source of electrical power for the town, which means that every light in every home in Springfield, every refrigerator, every television, every street lamp and traffic signal runs on power generated by this facility. Burns doesn't just own a business. He owns the infrastructure of daily life in this community. And the infrastructure he owns is, by any reasonable measurement, one of the most catastrophically mismanaged industrial facilities in the history of fiction. In one episode, a surprise safety inspection of the plant uncovers 342 separate violations. 342. The inspectors don't have to go looking for problems. The problems are everywhere. They're in the walls, in the cooling system, in the waste disposal protocols, in the basic operational procedures that keep a nuclear reactor from poisoning its surrounding environment. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to regulatory standards is $56 million. Burns refuses to spend it. Not because the money would bankrupt him. Burns is a multi-billionaire. He could write that check without meaningful impact on his fortune. He refuses because spending the money would mean acknowledging the violations exist, and acknowledging the violations exist would mean someone might start asking what those violations had already done to the community living downwind. And the violations themselves are not minor clerical errors. They are not paperwork problems or small procedural gaps that a competent team could close in an afternoon. These are fundamental structural failures in how the plant manages radioactive material. Radioactive waste is being dumped directly into bodies of water near the plant. The same water that feeds into Springfield's rivers, the same water that people fish in, the same water that flows downstream toward residential areas. Radioactive waste is also being deposited on children's playgrounds. Not stored near them, not accidentally spilled adjacent to them. Deposited on them, as though the site selection was deliberate. Plutonium, one of the most dangerous radioactive materials on Earth, is being used as a paperweight on someone's desk inside the facility. The cooling towers, the structures specifically designed to prevent heat and radioactive steam from escaping into the environment, are cracked, and the repair solution that has been applied to those cracks is chewing gum. Someone in a position of authority looked at a cracked cooling tower in a nuclear facility and decided that a piece of chewing gum was an adequate structural fix. There are luminous rats running through the lower levels of the building. Not metaphorically luminous, not poetically luminous. Physically glowing rats, animals whose bodies have absorbed enough radioactive material to emit light visibly in the dark, scurrying through the corridors of a working nuclear facility that serves the entire electrical grid of a populated town. And then there is the detail that the show drops so casually, so offhandedly, that most viewers process it and move on without fully registering what they just heard. In the basement of the Springfield nuclear power plant, there are human skeletons. Not the skeletons of animals, human skeletons. The bones of people, never identified, never explained, resting inside the lower levels of a working reactor facility. The show doesn't investigate this. It doesn't follow up. It shows you the bones and returns to the main storyline. And nobody in Springfield asks a single question about whose remains those are or how they came to be there. Now consider the person whose job it is to prevent all of this from happening. The safety inspector responsible for ensuring that the Springfield nuclear power plant does not poison its community is Homer Simpson, a man whose IQ, as stated by the show's own creator, is 55. A man who, as revealed in a later episode, has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function below the baseline that nature intended. A man who falls asleep at his workstation with such regularity that it has become a defining visual of his character. A man who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into a reactor core to see what would happen. Homer is not merely an incompetent employee who stumbled into the wrong job. Homer is, within the logic of the show, the single least qualified human being on the planet to hold the position of nuclear safety inspector, and he has been holding that position inside that facility, adjacent to that leaking reactor, for the entirety of his adult working life. Blinky and the question nobody asked. The first visible physical mutation in Springfield appears in Season 2. The three-eyed fish named Blinky is pulled from a river near the power plant, and the discovery immediately becomes a national news event within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence of environmental contamination. The fish becomes a symbol of what the power plant is doing to the natural world around Springfield. Burns is forced, in one of the show's most memorable sequences, to eat the fish on live television in an attempt to prove that there is nothing wrong with it. The town watches. The moment passes. And nobody asks the obvious question. If the fish pulled from the river near the power plant have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people drinking from the same water source? The show lets you sit with that question for 6 more seasons before it provides the closest thing to an answer. In Season 8, the episode that features Mulder and Scully investigating an alien sighting near Springfield builds toward a dramatic revelation. Homer has seen something in the woods, something that glows, something that moves with an eerie, floating quality. The town panics. Federal agents arrive. And when the truth is finally revealed, the being Homer encountered in the forest isn't an alien at all. It's Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes weekly medical treatments so intensive, so chemically extreme, so radiation-saturated that they cause his body to emit a visible green glow. After each session, he emerges from the treatment facility in a dazed, euphoric state, wandering through the forest surrounding the plant like something from another world. And the glow isn't a metaphor. Burns literally produces visible light from his body after these treatments. The radiation has saturated him so completely that his skin becomes bioluminescent for a period after each dose. The townspeople see this glowing figure in the woods, and their collective explanation is that it must be extraterrestrial, not the nuclear facility on the edge of town, not the decades of radioactive runoff into their water supply. An alien from outer space. That is where their minds go, because the power plant is so normalized, so thoroughly woven into the background of daily life in Springfield, that it has become invisible as a threat. The thing they should be looking at has become the thing they no longer see. And then there is the Simpsons movie. In the film, Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency, an actual federal agency operating within the show's universe, determines that the only viable response is physical containment. A massive dome is sealed over the entire town, trapping every resident inside. The reasoning, as stated by the EPA within the film, is that Springfield's pollution has reached levels that pose a threat to the surrounding region. The town must be isolated to prevent its contamination from spreading. Think carefully about what that means. The United States federal government looked at Springfield, assessed the environmental conditions, and concluded that the entire town was so fundamentally toxic, so deeply contaminated, that the only solution was to seal it off from the rest of the country. Springfield isn't classified as a community with a pollution problem. Springfield is classified as a contamination zone. The people inside it, every single resident who has been drinking that water, breathing that air, and living within the shadow of those cracked cooling towers for their entire lives, are already inside the dome when it goes up. They are sealed in with the contamination, because as far as the federal government is concerned, they are the contamination. The physical evidence on the residents themselves. Once you start looking at the physical characteristics of Springfield's population through the lens of the radiation theory, the evidence becomes almost overwhelming in its consistency. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not occur in human biology. He has 4 fingers on each hand, a characteristic shared by every Springfield resident and virtually no one from outside the town. His eyes bulge in a way that suggests some kind of thyroid or pressure abnormality. His IQ, as noted, is at a level that would qualify as a clinical disability, and his body absorbs punishment at a rate that is not simply superhuman but biologically impossible by any standard of medical knowledge. He has been shot, he has been electrocuted, he has fallen from cliffs, been struck by cars, survived explosions at distances that should have been lethal, and walked away from every single incident. His healing rate is absurd. His pain tolerance exists in a different category from that of normal human beings. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers, and hair that has maintained an identical, architecturally improbable tower shape for 36 years without visible maintenance or product. Marge briefly worked at the nuclear power plant herself during one story arc. She was exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same leaking systems. Her children, all 3 of them, were conceived and born after both parents had already been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. And the children themselves. Bart, Lisa, Maggie. All born in Springfield. All raised in Springfield. All drinking the same water, breathing the same air, going to a school whose playground received radioactive waste as though it were fertilizer. And every one of them has physical characteristics that do not appear in normal human populations. The spiky hair that maintains its shape without any visible product, the overbites, the yellowed skin that covers every Springfield resident regardless of their stated ethnic background. That last detail is the one that makes the theory crystallize. Because here is the thing the show has been quietly doing for decades, a thing that most viewers accept as a stylistic choice without considering what it means within the logic of the show's own world. When celebrities appear in Springfield, when guest characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes sit differently in their faces. Their features conform more closely to actual human anatomy than the features of the people who live in Springfield. The show draws outsiders with more realistic proportions than it draws residents. And the explanation that most people reach for is simply that this is the art style, that it's just how The Simpsons looks, that the guest star is drawn more realistically because they're a real person being caricatured rather than a fictional character being rendered in the show's visual language. But within the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live inside Springfield and people who come from outside it. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look like people. The animals confirm it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners. Blinky the fish is the most famous example, but Springfield's wildlife broadly conforms to patterns of environmental mutation consistent with heavy radioactive exposure. The show is not subtle about this. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and explicitly frames it as evidence of what the radiation is doing to living organisms in the area. And then it asks you to believe that these same organisms, living in the same environment, drinking the same water, include a large population of humans on whom the radiation has had no meaningful effect. Burns knows. Burns has always known. The show makes this explicit across multiple episodes, and it's worth spending time on because this is where the theory stops being a collection of circumstantial details and becomes something more deliberate. Burns undergoes those weekly medical treatments. He funds private medical research. He has personal physicians on retainer who manage his health with a precision and thoroughness unavailable to ordinary Springfield residents. And the reason he can maintain this level of medical management is directly connected to his lifetime of proximity to radioactive material. Burns doesn't just understand radiation in an abstract corporate sense. He understands it personally, intimately, in his cells and his blood and his weekly schedule of treatments that keep him alive for exactly 7 more days each time. He knows what radioactive exposure does to biological systems because radioactive exposure is, in a literal sense, what keeps his own biological system functioning. When German investors briefly purchased the Springfield nuclear power plant in one episode, the first thing they did was fire Homer Simpson. They recognized immediately that having an incompetent safety inspector was not a quirk of the plant's culture, but a fundamental liability. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code. The estimate very nearly bankrupted them. Burns purchased the plant back and immediately rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within days. Homer's incompetence ensures that the violations continue, that the radiation keeps leaking, that the water stays contaminated, and that Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and through those two things, its entire population. A population that, after decades of radioactive exposure to their water, their air, and their environment, may have had the portion of their brains responsible for critical thinking gradually eroded away. The crayon and what it means. In Season 12, the show reveals that Homer has had a crayon lodged in his brain since early childhood, and that the crayon has been physically pressing against his frontal lobe, suppressing his cognitive function for his entire life. When the crayon is removed in that episode, Homer's IQ spikes dramatically. He becomes articulate. He becomes perceptive. He becomes capable of understanding the world around him with a clarity he has never experienced as an adult. And it makes him miserable. The episode treats this as a comedy premise about the burden of intelligence, and it is funny, but the tragedy underneath the comedy is genuine. Homer, freed from the cognitive fog of the crayon, can see Springfield clearly. He can understand the systems at work around him. He can recognize what the power plant is doing to his community. He can see his job for what it is and understand why it exists the way it does. And the clarity is unbearable enough that he chooses, deliberately and consciously, to have the crayon put back in. He chooses stupidity. He chooses the fog. But the question the show never asks, the one that sits underneath the comedy, is how that crayon got into Homer's brain in the first place, and how it stayed there undiscovered for his entire life. Homer visits doctors in Springfield throughout the series. He receives medical care in Springfield. He gets checkups. He is seen by Springfield's medical establishment on numerous occasions. And not a single doctor, not once, in all those years, found a foreign object lodged in his skull. Either every doctor in Springfield is incompetent beyond any rational explanation, or someone in Springfield's medical infrastructure knew that crayon was there and chose not to remove it. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare system, the way it extends into the town's economy and politics and municipal government, then the crayon stops being an accident. It becomes something else. It becomes the physical manifestation of a system that is invested in keeping Homer exactly as he is, damaged enough to be compliant, impaired enough to be ineffective, cognitively limited enough to spend 30 years sleeping at the safety console of a nuclear reactor without ever realizing what his presence at that console is actually for. The radiation theory doesn't explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them. It threads through every strange detail, every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every physical characteristic that deviates from human norms, and it connects them to a single source, a single facility, a single man who has been profiting from the contamination for longer than most of Springfield's residents have been alive. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town with eccentric residents and charming local color. It's a contamination zone. The residents aren't eccentric. They're symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline has been the cause of all of it, hiding in plain sight for 36 years, exactly the way it was designed to hide. Before we move on, drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. And if you're finding this relaxing, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you know. Now, let's keep going. Section 2. Homer's Coma and the Dream World. What if he never woke up? Here is a thought that is going to follow you for a while after tonight. What if the radiation theory is correct, but only inside the imagination of a man who has been unconscious since the spring of 1993? On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. It was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was clean and simple. Bart escalates a series of April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one larger than the last, until he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop, places it in an industrial paint shaker, and returns it to the refrigerator. When Homer opens it, the resulting explosion sends him to the hospital. While he's recovering in his hospital bed, he spots a vending machine across the room. He tries to retrieve a candy bar. The machine tips over. It lands on Homer. He flatlines. He enters a coma. Not a cutaway gag, not a dream sequence flagged by a wavy dissolve, but a genuine, canonically established, clinically confirmed comatose state. Homer Simpson's conscious mind, in the spring of 1993, goes dark. The episode ends with him apparently waking up. Bart tearfully confesses everything at his bedside. Homer springs awake and immediately strangles his son. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The audience moves on. Except, in the final moments of that episode, the show tells you something specific. During Homer's coma, he lost 5% of his brain function. Permanently. 5% of his brain was destroyed during the time he was unconscious, and it is never coming back. The show presents this as a throwaway coda, a last joke before the credits. Homer doesn't understand why he's laughing when he hears this news. The family finds it endearing. Nobody finds it alarming. And the show continued for 32 more years as though nothing had happened. Unless nothing did happen. Unless the waking up scene was not a depiction of Homer regaining consciousness, but rather the beginning of a dream in which Homer imagines regaining consciousness, because the alternative, the truth, is that he never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory. It is the single most popular, most debated, most elaborately evidenced fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. The basic proposition is simple. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every impossible event, every celebrity appearance, every journey, every adventure, every crisis and resolution, is a dream being generated by the mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The evidence for this theory accumulates across decades of episodes, and it is deeply, genuinely unsettling the more of it you hold in your head at once. Before and after. The tonal earthquake. The most immediate piece of evidence is the shift in the show's tone that occurs after Season 4. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in the sense that any of it could happen to a real family, but grounded in the sense that the problems it explored were recognizable. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers whether she's happy in her marriage. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has to deal with the loss when he leaves. Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year in school and has to genuinely reckon with what that means for his identity. These are the problems of actual families, filtered through satire and absurdity, but rooted in emotional truth. The show's core was the Simpson family trying to navigate the ordinary chaos of everyday American life. After the coma, everything changes. Homer goes to space. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society with ancient traditions and elaborate ceremonies. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades. Homer meets God, in person, face to face, not in a dream sequence but in a conversation that the show presents as canonical. Homer meets God twice. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs across subsequent seasons. He travels to dozens of countries, he befriends celebrities, he survives physical traumas that would kill a trained military unit. The shift from family sitcom to surreal fever dream is so dramatic, so complete, that it has been the subject of ongoing debate among fans for over 20 years. The internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons got bad, when it lost its way, when it stopped being the show it used to be, for as long as the internet has been interested in The Simpsons. The coma theory offers a precise answer to that question. The show didn't get bad in any conventional sense. Homer's brain got worse. The dreams generated by a mind in coma are not bound by the rules of waking life. They don't have to be plausible. They can be whatever the dreaming mind needs them to be. And as the brain generating the dream slowly loses function, as the 5% becomes 6, becomes 10, becomes 20, the dreams become less coherent, less grounded, less constrained by the physics and logic of the world the dreamer once lived in. The escalation into absurdity that fans read as a failure of the writing staff is, under the coma theory, a symptom of Homer's deteriorating neural function. The prophecy that preceded everything. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere titled Homer the Heretic, Homer has a face-to-face conversation with God. A real conversation. The two of them speak directly. Homer asks questions and God answers. And during this conversation, God tells Homer something that the show never follows up on directly, but that the coma theory renders as a prophecy. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. His time, God says, is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. If you read that exchange as a canonical theological statement within the show's universe, God was telling Homer that his conscious life was about to end. That the existence Homer had known, the waking life with his family in the house on Evergreen Terrace, was approaching its conclusion. And 6 months after that warning, Homer's mind went dark. Under the coma theory, God wasn't making a promise about Homer's spiritual future. He was delivering a timeline, and the timeline was accurate to within half a year. Why nobody ages. The single piece of evidence that the coma theory explains most elegantly, more elegantly than any other theory ever proposed, is the most fundamental strangeness at the heart of the show. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle or a gray hair in over 3 decades of on-screen life. The show uses what the television industry calls a floating timeline, where the present is always the current year and the characters simply do not advance through time the way real people do. Other theories address this. The radiation theory proposes that the biological mutations caused by nuclear exposure have somehow suspended the normal aging process at a cellular level. The cartoon logic explanation says this is simply how animated shows work, that it's a production decision rather than a narrative one, that the same is true of the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo and dozens of other long-running animated series. But the coma theory has the simplest answer, the most devastating answer. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and has not woken up since. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine his children growing older because he wasn't there to watch them grow. He doesn't know what 11-year-old Bart looks like. He doesn't know what 9-year-old Lisa sounds like. Maggie's development into a toddler and then a child and then a young person is something that happened in the real world in the years that Homer lay unconscious in a hospital bed, and because he wasn't there to witness it, his dreaming mind has no material to work with. His children are locked forever at the ages they were on the day the vending machine fell. The world of Homer's coma dream is preserved exactly as it existed at the moment he lost consciousness, because that's what happens to the mind in a coma. It doesn't have access to new information from the outside world. It can only work with what it already knew. And what Homer already knew on the last day of his waking life was a 10-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter and an infant girl who had not yet said her first word. That is the Springfield that has existed in every episode since season 4, not a cartoon convenience. A frozen photograph of a moment, endlessly relived, because the man inside the photograph can't move past it. Celebrity voices through the fog. One of the more entertaining features of later-era Simpsons is the sheer volume of celebrity guest appearances. The show became, in the 90s and into the 2000s, a kind of cultural nexus where famous people from every field of human endeavor would show up in Springfield. Musicians, athletes, politicians, actors, scientists, historical figures rendered as animated characters for a single episode before disappearing. Under the coma theory, every one of those appearances has an explanation. Homer's brain, lying in a hospital bed, receives input from the external world, even in its unconscious state. Sounds penetrate. The television in the hospital room reaches him. Conversations at his bedside reach him. His family talks to him. People bring radios. Nurses discuss the news while checking his monitors. Homer's brain absorbs fragments of this ambient information, names and voices and cultural references from the world outside his coma, and weaves them into the dream. When a celebrity appears in Springfield, it's because Homer's mind heard that person's name or voice through the fog of unconsciousness and incorporated them into the simulation. He's not dreaming about celebrities visiting his town. He's processing external stimuli and translating them into dream imagery. This is why the celebrity appearances become more frequent as the show goes on. Homer's brain, growing less organized over time, becomes less selective about what it incorporates from the outside world. The dream becomes noisier, more crowded with fragments, more populated by faces and voices that Homer's mind scooped up from its environment and placed, without much editorial judgment, into the story it was telling itself. The show acknowledges what it won't admit. The coma theory is remarkable for the way the show has handled it. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout was accompanied by a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes up from a long coma, revealing that every bizarre and outlandish episode since season 4 was just a dream. The scene was animated, voiced, fully produced. The revelation was played with emotional weight, and then the show immediately retracted it. The producers described it as a hoax scene, planted by hackers, not real, not canon, don't worry about it. The clip was dismissed, but consider the effort that went into dismissing it. The show's creators animated and produced a fully realized version of the coma theory's central revelation, released it into the world in a context where audiences would encounter it, and then needed an entire cover story to walk it back. They showed you the answer and told you it was a joke, and the audience laughed, the way Homer laughed when he was told he'd permanently lost 5% of his brain. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory in 2015. He said it wasn't true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But in that same dismissal, he left every piece of evidence untouched. He didn't explain why the show's tone shifted so dramatically after season 4. He didn't address the God prophecy in Homer, the heretic. He didn't explain why nobody ages, or why the plots become progressively more detached from physical reality as the series continues. He said it wasn't true and moved on, which is precisely what you would expect from someone who knows a theory is correct but cannot officially confirm it without ending the show. Because here is what the coma theory does that the official explanations cannot do. It makes all of it make sense. Every piece of strangeness, every impossible event, every character trait, every unexplained continuity break, every escalating absurdity of post-season 4 storytelling slots into place with a precision that storytelling convenience and cartoon logic simply cannot match. Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind controls the story, so his mind can't kill him. The world resets between episodes because that's what sleeping minds do. They clear the state between dreams. They begin each night from the same baseline. Homer's coma dream resets because the dreaming brain operates in cycles, and at the end of each cycle, everything returns to normal so the dream can begin again. The celebrities, the impossible adventures, the hundreds of jobs, the meetings with world leaders and historical figures and divine beings, all of it is the wandering, deteriorating imagination of a man who wanted so desperately to keep living in the world, he knew that he built a version of it inside his own head and has been living there, safe and complete, ever since. The emotional truth at the center. If the coma theory is true, the emotional logic of The Simpsons changes entirely. Homer's deepest wish is embarrassingly simple. He wants his family. That's the whole of it. He wants Marge to still love him, to still be there when he comes home from work. He wants Bart to be his mischievous 10-year-old boy, chaotic and hilarious, and fundamentally kind underneath the performance. He wants Lisa to play her saxophone, to argue with him about things he doesn't understand, to be brilliant in ways that confuse him but that he loves without reservation. He wants Maggie to be small enough to hold, to fit in the crook of his arm, to need him in the uncomplicated way that infants need their parents. He wants Friday evenings at the house on Evergreen Terrace. He wants the couch and the television and the cold beer and the sound of his family moving around upstairs. He wants that to last forever. And in the coma, it does. The dream gives him everything he wants, held in perfect amber, sealed against the movement of time and the inevitability of change. His children never grow up. His wife never leaves. His life never ends. The ordinary happiness of a particular Friday evening in suburban Springfield, extended without limit, without interruption, into an infinity of ordinary Fridays. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It's the only kind of heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. And every time Homer survives something impossible in the dream, every time the world resets to normal at the end of an episode, every time the credits roll and everything goes back to the way it should be, that's not lazy writing. That's Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, the dream ends. And if the dream ends, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means confronting how many years have passed. How old his children really are now, out there in the actual world. Whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting by his hospital bed, whether there is still a Homer to come back to, or whether the family on Evergreen Terrace moved on long ago and built a life in the world that continued without him. Or, worse, not waking up at all. That's what the coma theory leaves you with, quietly, when you follow it to the end. Not a clever solution to a puzzle. Something much heavier than that. A man who loved his family so much that he built them a world inside his dying mind and has been living in it ever since, dreaming their faces in the dark, keeping them exactly as they were on the last day he saw them, because the alternative is a grief too large to survive. The show will never confirm this. The show will continue to dismiss it with official statements and retracted deleted scenes and executive producer interviews. But the evidence is baked into the structure of the show itself, accumulated across 32 years of episodes, and it does not go away when you close the Reddit thread. Nobody ages. Reality keeps getting stranger, and Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in his dream, he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The greatest mystery in animation. Before we go any further, let's acknowledge something. The official answer to who shot Mr. Burns is Maggie Simpson. Season 7, Episode 1. Baby did it, case closed. Except the case was never really closed, because the evidence doesn't add up the way the show wants you to believe it does. The more carefully you look at this mystery, the more the official answer starts to feel less like a solution and more like the thing that replaced a solution, because the people in charge of Springfield needed the question to stop being asked. Let's go back to the summer of 1995. Season 6, Episode 25, Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1. What The Simpsons pulled off with this episode had genuinely never been attempted by an animated series before. A meticulously constructed mystery, a deliberate cliffhanger designed to generate public engagement, complete with a national contest inviting viewers to submit their guesses, and promising that the winner would be animated into an actual episode of the show. Fox promoted it with the kind of energy usually reserved for presidential debates. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, treating the fictional shooting as though it were a real unsolved crime. The Simpsons wasn't just a TV show that summer. It was a national puzzle. And the puzzle was built on the fact that, by the end of Part 1, essentially every significant character in Springfield had been given a clear, specific, emotionally convincing motive to want Charles Montgomery Burns dead. Burns had stolen the oil discovered beneath Springfield Elementary School, wiping out the school's budget and ending groundskeeper Willie's job. He had used that stolen wealth to build a mechanical device capable of blocking sunlight from reaching the entire town, a plan so megalomaniacal and so practically destructive that it beggars belief even within the show's universe. The device was deployed. Springfield lost the sun. Burns had literally stolen daylight from an entire community to force them to purchase his electricity. When his own assistant Smithers protested, Burns fired him. So when Burns staggered into the town's sundial with a single gunshot wound and collapsed, the show had done something structurally very clever. It had arranged a situation where the audience couldn't rationally eliminate any suspect without acknowledging that every remaining suspect was equally plausible. The evidence that doesn't add up. Part 2 aired in September 1995 and presented the resolution as a detective procedural. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police stumbled through the investigation. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession collapsed when it became clear he'd been completely intoxicated at the time and had actually shot someone else entirely, an elderly man named Jasper, in his wooden leg, at a different location. One by one, suspects were cleared. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had what is genuinely one of the most creative alibis in television history. A full musical number explaining that he had channeled his rage into the composition of an original samba. The investigation stalled until police recovered a critical piece of evidence: an eyelash found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis linked the eyelash to a member of the Simpson family. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. He had arguably the most emotionally charged motive of anyone in Springfield. Burns had been employed Homer for years and had never once succeeded in remembering his name. That specific humiliation had been building across multiple episodes into something that the show framed as genuinely corrosive to Homer's sense of self. Homer is arrested. He is about to be convicted. And then Burns wakes up from his coma and identifies his shooter. It was Maggie. According to Burns's account, he encountered the Simpson infant in the parking lot after the town meeting. He attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. And then everyone nodded and went home. But let's look at what the show is actually asking you to accept, and whether the pieces actually fit together the way it claims they do. The contest nobody won. Fox invited viewers across America to submit guesses for who shot Burns. The prize was significant enough to generate real competitive interest. The winner would be animated into a future episode. Thousands of entries arrived. And according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, from the randomly selected sample that was actually reviewed, not a single person guessed the correct answer. Nobody won. The prize was awarded randomly to someone who didn't have the right answer, and that person received a cash payment instead of the animated appearance because their submission didn't match the solution. The show's writers acknowledge on the commentary that they became aware of one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night Part 1 originally broadcast, someone using a college internet account. By the time the contest concluded and the producers tried to locate this person, the account was inactive. They could not find the one person who had gotten it right. Think about what that means for the mystery as a puzzle. The show's creators designed a mystery, promoted it nationally as solvable from the clues presented in Part 1, ran a contest around the solvability of that mystery, and when the answer was revealed, essentially no one in the participating audience had figured it out. The one person who had solved it correctly couldn't be found. Either the clues were genuinely inadequate for the task the show set itself, or the red herrings were so effective that they overwhelmed the actual evidence, or the answer didn't follow from the clues in the way the show claimed it did. The writers have acknowledged in various interviews that the answer wasn't fully decided when Part 1 was written. The clues were planted in a direction that didn't necessarily point toward Maggie. The mystery was, to a significant degree, reverse-engineered. The answer was chosen, and then the evidence was adjusted to accommodate it, rather than the evidence leading inevitably to the answer. That's a very different thing from a fairly constructed mystery. The sundial clue undermines itself. The central piece of physical evidence that the show uses to justify its conclusion is Burns's position when he collapsed. His hands fell on two letters on the sundial, W and S. From Burns's own perspective, lying on the dial as he collapsed, those letters read as M and S. The show asks you to read this as Burns pointing to Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself, in Part 2, explicitly states that his hands landing on those letters was not intentional. He did not position himself deliberately to communicate his attacker's identity. He simply fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The central clue, the one visual image that the show treats as the most important single piece of evidence in the entire mystery, is described by the victim himself as a coincidence. Burns didn't point at those letters. Gravity pointed at them. So the most famous piece of evidence in the history of the show is, by the explicit admission of the person it supposedly came from, meaningless. The gun and what it tells us. Burns carried a firearm in a holster. Shortly before the shooting occurred, the holster is shown empty. The gun was already gone from his person before the attack happened. This means the shooter didn't bring a weapon to the town meeting. They used Burns's own gun against him. The implication of this is significant. Most of the people at the town meeting that night arrived angry enough to have brought weapons. Several are visibly armed. The person who shot Burns was specifically someone who did not come prepared to shoot anyone, who had no weapon of their own, who encountered Burns's gun through chance or circumstance, and used it in a moment that was either impulsive or opportunistic. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. That part of the official story is not impossible. But so does a dozen other characters who weren't carrying weapons that night. Those last words. Before Burns was shot, the last thing he said was, "Oh, it's you." Not, Who's there? Not stay back. Not any of the phrases a person uses when confronted by an unexpected threat. Oh, it's you. The way you'd greet someone familiar. Someone you recognize without surprise. Someone who does not register to you as a danger. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson in any meaningful sense before this episode? Has he ever interacted with her in a way that would make her a recognizable presence in his mind? The show doesn't establish a prior relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see an infant he has never meaningfully interacted with and respond with calm, almost casual recognition, "Oh, it's you," doesn't track. "Oh, it's you" sounds like something you say to someone who you've been having ongoing problems with. Someone who has a reason to be angry with you. Someone whose presence at this particular moment, in this particular place, suggests a confrontation you perhaps were expecting was coming eventually. A baby who wanted her lollipop back doesn't fit that description. Homer's confession that nobody investigated. In season 18, Homer claims to have been the one who shot Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, without significant framing as a joke or a piece of misdirection. He simply states it. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Chief Wiggum doesn't file paperwork. The richest man in Springfield isn't notified that someone has just publicly confessed to his attempted murder. The show treats Homer's confession as a throwaway moment and moves on. Two explanations exist for this. Homer is lying, seeking attention, or trying to seem interesting, which is entirely consistent with his character. Or Homer is telling the truth and the original verdict was wrong, and Maggie was blamed for something her father actually did. If the second reading is correct, then a baby was formally identified as having committed an act of violence, and the actual perpetrator walked free, and the show has been living with this covered-up truth for over 20 seasons. The Marge theory. One of the most carefully constructed alternative theories proposes that Marge was the real shooter. The argument is remarkably coherent. Marge had as strong a motive as anyone in Springfield. Burns had destroyed her children's school, injured her family's dog, and stolen sunlight from the town where her family lived. She is a devoted mother in the precise, protective sense that makes a person capable of violence when the people they love are threatened. But the key element of the Marge theory is not her motive. It's Burns's response. Burns, in a previous episode, had developed an infatuation with Marge. He fell in love with her. The episode treated this as comedy, but within the canon it establishes something real. Burns has feelings for Marge that go beyond the ordinary resentment he holds for Springfield's general population. If Marge was the shooter, Burns would have known her immediately. "Oh, it's you" would make perfect sense directed at the woman he had feelings for. The woman whose family he had systematically harmed. The woman who had finally arrived at the end of her patience with him. And if Marge was the shooter, Burns, waking up in the hospital with a bullet wound and a second chance at life, might have made the decision to protect her. He could have identified Homer instead, except Homer had an alibi built around the gun's trajectory, and the DNA evidence was ambiguous enough to be redirected. Pointing toward Maggie was cleaner. Maggie is untouchable. Maggie is an infant. No jury, as Chief Wiggum explicitly acknowledges, would convict a baby. Except, Wiggum adds, maybe Texas. Maggie was the perfect resolution. She couldn't be prosecuted. She couldn't deny the accusation. She couldn't understand what she was being accused of well enough to offer any counter-narrative. If someone in a position of authority wanted to protect the real shooter, directing the investigation toward a 1-year-old was the most efficient solution imaginable. The final shot. The episode ends with everyone leaving the hospital room. Maggie is left alone. She checks her surroundings, making sure nobody is watching. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that unmistakably mimics the act of pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie did it. She remembers. She's reenacting it. But babies imitate. That is one of the most fundamental and well-documented behaviors of early childhood development. Infants imitate what they see. They do not need to have performed an action themselves to imitate it. Maggie could be reenacting something she watched someone else do. She was present for the shooting. She was in the vicinity. She saw a gun fired. If Maggie witnessed the shooting rather than committed it, that final pacifier moment is not a confession. It's the memory of a traumatic moment being replayed by a mind too young to process it any other way. The show wants you to read it as a confession. It is framed that way. but the framing cannot survive contact with what we actually know about infant cognition and behavior. A mystery that was closed, not solved. The alternate Smithers ending was fully animated and produced, not as a sketch or a rough draft, but as a complete, voiced, finished version of the episode with a different conclusion. This version was shown in a clip show special, where it was dismissed as an example of what the resolution could have been, with the implication that the DNA evidence would have had to be ignored for it to work. The host of that clip show, Troy McClure, makes this dismissal with a wink at the audience. And the show explicitly references the O.J. Simpson trial in that same moment, noting that in real life, juries do sometimes ignore DNA evidence, and that such things do happen. The show is acknowledging, in its own roundabout way, that the evidence can be made to point in whatever direction you need it to point. That the official answer is not necessarily the correct answer. That the gap between solving a mystery and closing a mystery is real, and that Springfield has chosen the latter. Burns's candidness about the sundial being accidental, Homer's unexamined confession, the final shot of Maggie mimicking what she may have only witnessed, the alternate endings that demonstrate the writer's own uncertainty about who actually pulled the trigger, the contest that nobody won. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was never solved. It was managed. The town needed an answer that wouldn't require anyone to go to prison or face consequences or challenge the power structure in any serious way. A baby who can't be prosecuted was the answer Springfield needed. Whether it was the answer that was true is a different question entirely. Section 4. The immortal Mr. Burns. A medical impossibility. Let's talk about the oldest man in Springfield. His age has been stated, implied, and contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s. He has described personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century as though they happened to him directly, in the first person, without the narrative distance that separates a story you've heard from a story you've lived. He has referenced working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. He served in the Second World War, though his role in that conflict was, as the show puts it with characteristic understatement, morally questionable at best. By the most conservative reading of the available evidence, Burns is somewhere north of 100 years old. By the more liberal readings, he's pushing toward 140. And he doesn't just exist, he functions. This is the detail that makes the Burns longevity question genuinely strange rather than merely improbable. A character who was extremely old but essentially inert, a sleeping fossil preserved in amber, would be strange but not mysterious. Burns is not inert. Burns runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates the municipal politics of Springfield with the dexterity of someone who has been playing that game for a very long time. He orchestrates schemes requiring sustained cognitive engagement, long-term planning, an active working understanding of modern finance, modern law, and modern technology. His body is clearly deteriorating. His physical strength is essentially non-existent. A strong breeze poses him genuine danger, but his mind is razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in the entire show. He outthinks everyone around him. He anticipates. He positions. He plays moves that don't resolve for seasons of episodes, and when they do resolve, they resolve in his favor, because he planned them that way. The show has given us a character who has been operating at the highest levels of strategic intelligence for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. How does he do it? The weekly treatment. The answer the show provides, in the episode featuring Mulder and Scully investigating Homer's alien sighting, is both precise and deeply unsettling. Burns undergoes a medical treatment once a week. The treatment is so intense, so chemically extreme, so saturated with what the show describes as a combination of medical interventions and radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. Not that without it his health declines. Without the treatment, Burns dies. The margin of error on his survival is a single week. Miss one appointment and the machinery keeping him alive stops functioning. The implication of this is staggering once you follow it to its logical conclusions. Burns is not surviving through any natural biological process. He has not aged gracefully or benefited from exceptional genetics or lived a particularly healthy lifestyle. He is being kept alive artificially, through a recurring medical intervention that has to be administered with absolute regularity on a schedule that allows for no deviation. His existence is mechanically maintained, the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing. Remove the servicing, and the machine fails. And the treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who has spent his entire career profiting from the energy released by nuclear fission, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, maintains his own biological function through controlled exposure to the same force he's been using to poison his town. Burns isn't just profiting from radiation, he's powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by his lifetime of proximity to nuclear material, beginning with his earliest work in the nuclear industry and continuing through a century of operating a nuclear facility, that it can no longer sustain itself through normal cellular processes. It requires external radioactive input the way a normal body requires calories. Take it away and the system collapses within 7 days. Three Stooges syndrome? The most famous medical revelation about Burns comes from a different episode, and it's played entirely for comedy. But under the radiation theory, it carries genuine explanatory weight. Burns visits a doctor who delivers news that the show frames as absurdist humor, but that makes a terrifying kind of sense once you understand the context. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one. Simultaneously, the doctor explains that the diseases are all present in his body at the same time, existing in a state of perfect equilibrium, each illness preventing the others from progressing, because they are all competing for the same limited biological resources. The doctor calls it Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to the classic comedy bit where three people try to walk through the same door at the same time and none of them can get through. Burns's diseases are all trying to kill him at once. Because they're all trying simultaneously, they create a biological gridlock. None of them can advance far enough to actually kill him because all the others are blocking the path. The show presents the doctor's conclusion that Burns is the sickest man in the United States, but functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is being blocked by everything else that should kill him. As a joke, it's one of the most quoted moments in the series. But if Burns's body has been managed through weekly radiation treatments for decades, the disease equilibrium isn't the result of extraordinary luck or some quirk of his personal biology. The treatments are maintaining it. The radiation keeps every illness in a state of perfect stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance and breaking through. Remove the treatments, break the equilibrium, and every disease in his body surges forward at once. His body is not a body in any conventional sense. It's a system. A biological machine that has to be tuned on a weekly schedule to prevent catastrophic failure. The doctor who told him he has every disease wasn't describing a curiosity. He was describing the consequences of a century of artificial maintenance. Burns's body has accumulated every disease because it's never been allowed to fight any of them off naturally. The radiation suppresses the natural immune processes that would eliminate pathogens. The diseases accumulate and accumulate because nothing in his biological architecture is capable of clearing them. And the result is this bizarre equilibrium where the accumulation of illness becomes its own form of stability. The Smithers equation. Wayland Smithers is, on the surface, a loyal assistant who has devoted his life to serving Charles Montgomery Burns out of a complicated mixture of professional admiration, personal affection, and a devotion that the show has always handled with more nuance than a simple punchline. But under the Burns longevity theory, Smithers is something more specific than a loyal assistant. Smithers is the maintenance schedule. He manages Burns's appointments, he monitors Burns's physical condition, he ensures that Burns arrives at every weekly treatment on time. He is vigilant about Burns's health in a way that the show has repeatedly depicted as bordering on obsession, but that looks entirely rational once you understand what's actually at stake. Smithers knows that if Burns misses a treatment, he has 7 days before the system fails. He knows that the disease equilibrium is being artificially maintained. He knows that the thing keeping Burns alive is a procedure that has to happen, without exception, every single week. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns purely out of love or admiration. He's devoted because he understands, with complete clarity, that his absence from Burns's life is a death sentence. Without Smithers managing the schedule, organizing the appointments, keeping Burns oriented toward the next treatment, Burns would slip, he would miss a week, the equilibrium would break, every illness in his body would surge forward simultaneously. The depth of Smithers's devotion makes sense when you understand it not as an emotional dependency, but as a logistical one. Burns has built the most sophisticated personal survival infrastructure imaginable, and the most critical component of that infrastructure is a human being whose primary function is making sure the machine keeps running on schedule. A history that shouldn't exist. The scope of historical experience that Burns possesses is, when catalogued, almost incomprehensible. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War in a capacity the show describes with deliberate vagueness. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for decades. He references the Gilded Age not as history but as lived experience, as something he was present for. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty extends back centuries, with the current Burns as merely the most recent expression of a lineage that has been accumulating wealth and power for so long that the founding of the American nation was, from his perspective, a relatively recent development. The show has depicted the Burns family tree as one of the oldest and most consistently powerful dynasties in American history. Not merely wealthy, but the kind of wealthy that shapes the conditions of other people's lives without those people having any real understanding of how it works or where it originates. The kind of wealthy that builds infrastructure and then charges everyone else to use it forever. The kind of wealthy that exists so far above the mechanism of legal accountability that the concept of consequences becomes more theoretical than practical. Burns inherited this legacy. He has been extending it for over a century. And this opens a question that the show never addresses directly, but that the immortality theory makes very hard to ignore. Is Burns unique? Or has the Burns family always found methods of extending their members' lifespans beyond natural limits? If the current Burns has been alive for over 100 years through the artificial management of radiation exposure and the weekly treatments that maintain his diseased body in fragile equilibrium, is it possible that previous Burns patriarchs employed analogous strategies? Before nuclear technology existed, before the radiation treatments that currently keep Burns alive were available, did the Burns family use other approaches to extend their hold on power across generations that should have required biological succession? The show doesn't answer this, but it does establish that the Burns dynasty has maintained continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity across centuries doesn't happen through ordinary generational inheritance. It requires something more deliberate. Either the Burns family has been extraordinarily lucky across multiple generations, or they have been extraordinarily clever about extending the productive lives of their patriarchs. The infrastructure of survival. Burns has come closer to dying more times than almost any other character in the show. He's been shot, he's been hospitalized dozens of times. He's collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been left alone in wilderness conditions that should have been fatal for a man of his age and frailty. And every time he comes back, the mechanism of his return is always the same. Not cartoon resilience, not narrative convenience. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through wealth, through the medical resources his fortune provides, the private physicians he retains, the experimental treatments his pharmaceutical connections can synthesize. Burns survives not because his body is strong, because it's not, but because he has spent over a century building a system specifically designed to ensure his survival, regardless of what his body does. Homer's resilience is passive. He absorbs damage and recovers because the dream won't let him die, or because the radiation has rendered him biologically abnormal, or simply because the show needs him alive for the next episode. Burns's resilience is engineered. It is the product of sustained, deliberate investment in the infrastructure of his own survival. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever corrupted, every doctor he has ever retained, every private research program he has ever funded, all of it has one ultimate purpose: keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor of his body running at a level that prevents catastrophic failure. Because if Burns dies, his empire dies with him. And empires don't allow themselves to die. They spend whatever it costs to survive. And in Springfield, the cost of Burns's survival is paid by everyone else. Too expensive to die. The genuinely alarming dimension of the Burns immortality theory is not that he might live forever. It's that Springfield needs him to. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns. Burns depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the wealth the power plant generates. It's a closed loop, a self-sustaining system where the man, the machine, and the money all feed each other in a cycle that has no obvious point of exit. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. Every business in town depends on the electricity the plant provides. Every job depends on the economic activity generated by the plant's operation. The municipal budget depends on the tax revenue the plant generates, or would generate if Burns paid his taxes, which is a separate problem. The town is economically hostage to the man whose facility is poisoning it. And Burns cannot die, because dying would mean the system he built finally has to answer for what it's done to the people living inside it. The pollution, the violations, the three-eyed fish, the decades of contaminated water, the radioactive playgrounds, all of it would have to be addressed, investigated, litigated. The consequences of a century of calculated negligence would fall on whatever legal and financial structures Burns leaves behind. So the system keeps running. Burns keeps being maintained. Springfield keeps paying the electricity bills that fund the treatments that keep the man alive who runs the facility that generates the bills. He's not immortal. He's too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds, might genuinely be forever. Section 5. The Secret Life of Maggie Simpson. The quietest person in Springfield? Maggie Simpson doesn't talk. She doesn't walk with any consistency. She communicates primarily through pacifier manipulation and the kind of pointed, sustained stare that suggests significantly more going on behind those enormous eyes than any reasonable assessment of infant cognition would predict. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, operating without language, without mobility, without any of the tools that adults use to navigate the world, Maggie Simpson has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a rebellion against an authoritarian daycare administrator. She rescued her family from multiple life-threatening situations through interventions that required planning, strategic thinking, and the kind of adaptability under pressure that most adults would struggle to demonstrate. She was formally tested and found to possess intelligence operating at levels that no standardized assessment designed for human children could accurately measure. Through all of it, every remarkable thing she has ever done, she has not said a single word. Not because she can't speak, because she has decided not to. That distinction is everything. The shooting and what happened after. We've already spent time on the question of whether Maggie actually fired the gun that put Burns in the hospital. That question is real and worth pursuing. But for the purposes of understanding Maggie as a character, whether or not she pulled the trigger matters less than what happened in the aftermath. A baby was formally identified by the relevant authorities as having committed an act of violence against the most powerful man in Springfield. The investigation proceeded. The evidence was examined. Chief Wiggum arrived at a conclusion, stated it publicly, and explicitly acknowledged that no legal consequence was possible because no jury would convict an infant. And then everyone moved on. But Maggie didn't move on. And the final shot of that episode, the one that most viewers read as a cute confirmation of her guilt, tells a much stranger story if you look at it with the right frame. Everyone else leaves the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around the space carefully, systematically, the way a person checks their surroundings before doing something they don't want witnessed. And then, having confirmed that she's unobserved, she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. Read that sequence of behaviors clinically. Step 1. Verify that the space is clear. Step 2. Confirm that no one is watching. Step 3. Perform the action in privacy. That is not reflexive behavior. It is not the random motor activity of a developing infant. It is a sequence of deliberate choices made in a specific order for a specific reason. It requires situational awareness of who else is present in a space. It requires memory of an event significant enough to replay. It requires caution, specifically the judgment that this gesture should not be performed in front of others. And it requires impulse control sufficient to delay the gesture until the socially appropriate moment, meaning when she's alone. Those characteristics are not associated with 1-year-old children. They are associated with someone who understands what they've done, understands the implications of it, and has made a strategic decision about who should and should not observe them acknowledging it. Maggie waited until she was alone. And then she showed herself, and only herself, that she knew. The Longest Daycare. In 2012, a theatrical short film featuring Maggie was screened before Ice Age Continental Drift, and subsequently nominated for an Academy Award. 7 minutes long. No dialogue from Maggie. A premise simple enough to fit in a single sentence. Maggie is dropped off at a rigidly managed daycare center and wants to protect a caterpillar from a bully named Gerald. What follows is not a children's short film. It's a mission film about a person with extraordinary cognitive capacity operating within the constraints of a body that can barely support her ambitions. Maggie doesn't just want to protect the caterpillar. She develops and executes a multi-stage plan to do so against meaningful opposition. She reads the environment of the facility. She identifies which staff members pose threats to her plan and maps their patrol patterns. She locates resources within the environment that could be useful. She identifies Gerald's behavioral patterns and uses that knowledge to anticipate his movements. She improvises when her original approach fails, adjusting her plan in real time based on new information, which is an advanced cognitive function that many adults perform poorly under pressure. And she does all of this without being able to walk reliably, without language, and without any adult having the slightest idea what she's doing, because she has ensured they don't. She operates in the margins of the adult's attention, in the spaces where no one is looking, because a baby isn't the kind of thing that makes adults look. She succeeds. The caterpillar becomes a butterfly. The facility's security measures are navigated. Gerald is outmaneuvered. Maggie releases the butterfly into the world and watches it fly away with an expression that in an adult would be called satisfaction. The cognitive capacity demonstrated in that 7-minute film is not infant cognition. It's not even average adult cognition. It's exceptional adult cognition operating through the physical limitations of a 1-year-old body. Her body can barely keep up with her mind. She falls. She stumbles. Her fine motor control is inconsistent, but her decision-making is flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct choice, optimized for the goal she's pursuing, adapted in real time to changing circumstances. The Lisa lesson. Here is the theory that makes Maggie's silence most coherent as a conscious choice, rather than a developmental limitation. Maggie has watched her older sister every day of her life. She has had a front-row seat to the experience of Lisa Simpson, which is a very particular and instructive experience if you're paying close attention. Lisa is brilliant. Lisa is genuinely, measurably, formally brilliant in a way that is established early in the show and maintained consistently. Her IQ is significantly higher than anyone else in her immediate family and most of the adults in Springfield. She is musically gifted, intellectually curious, morally serious, and articulate in ways that adults around her frequently find uncomfortable rather than impressive. And what has Lisa's brilliance done for her? Isolation. The more Lisa demonstrates what she's capable of, the more she separates herself from the people around her who can't engage with her at that level. Her intelligence is her most defining trait and also the primary source of her loneliness. Mockery. Lisa speaks up and gets laughed at, or dismissed, or redirected towards something more age-appropriate. The adults in her world consistently fail to take her seriously even when she is demonstrably correct. Punishment. Lisa challenges authority, challenges assumptions, challenges the accepted version of events, and the social cost of that challenging is paid by Lisa. She argues with teachers. She confronts established narratives. She insists on the truth when the truth is inconvenient. And the response, from Springfield's adults and institutions, is consistently to make her position more difficult, rather than to engage with the substance of what she's saying. Lisa's intelligence is visible. It's announced. She wears it on the outside, extends it into every room she enters, makes it part of her identity in a way that ensures everyone around her knows exactly what she's dealing with. And the world around her, specifically Springfield, which does not reward intelligence and actively penalizes the kind of truth-telling that intelligence enables, responds by making her life harder. Maggie has watched this happen every day since she was born, and Maggie has drawn a different conclusion from the evidence. Not the conclusion Lisa drew, which is that you fight regardless of the cost, that you speak the truth regardless of who's listening, that you hold your intelligence up like a banner even if the wind keeps tearing it down. Maggie drew the opposite conclusion. Silence is power. Invisibility is protection. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish without interference. The strategic genius of being overlooked. Every remarkable thing Maggie has ever done, she has done while no one was watching. The shooting happened in a parking lot after everyone had gone to the meeting. The daycare rebellion happened in a facility where the entire premise is that the infants are being minimally supervised. The family rescues happened in situations where the adults were occupied with their own crises and weren't monitoring the baby. Every heroic moment, every display of extraordinary cognition, every instance where Maggie was the most capable person in a situation, happened in spaces where no one was paying close enough attention to notice what she was doing. And Maggie has ensured that this is consistently the case by maintaining the most effective cover imaginable. She presents as exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: passive, quiet, helpless, dependent on others for every basic need, in constant physical contact with a pacifier, the most infantilizing prop imaginable. She is none of those things, but by performing them flawlessly, she creates a perceptual environment in which no one would ever think to monitor her closely, suspect her of strategic behavior, or consider that the infant in the corner might be the most dangerous person in the room. Think about how different this is from every other intelligent character in the show. Lisa announces her intelligence. Burns performs his ruthlessness. Homer's limitations are visible to everyone, including Homer. Even Smithers' devotion is worn openly. Springfield is full of people who present exactly as what they are, whose inner states map onto their outer presentations with reasonable accuracy. Maggie is the only character in the show who is systematically, consistently, and apparently deliberately presenting as something fundamentally different from what she actually is. For 36 years, without slipping, without a single moment where the mask comes off in public, that level of sustained performance isn't incidental, it's a strategy. And it's the strategy of someone who has assessed the available options and determined that operating invisibly produces better outcomes than operating visibly. Radiation and the opposite pole. Connect Maggie to the radiation theory, and something interesting happens. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations, and if those mutations affect each person differently based on their biology, their age of exposure, their proximity to the source, and countless other variables, then the distribution of effects across the population wouldn't be uniform. Some people would be damaged, some people might be enhanced. The same environmental force, acting on different biological substrates, would produce different results. Homer's cognitive function has been diminished. Whatever the crayon, the radiation, and the decades of living in Springfield's contaminated environment have done to his brain, the effect has been in the direction of reduction. He is less than he might have been. Maggie's cognitive function has been amplified, whether through the same radiation operating differently on her younger, developing brain, or through some other mechanism entirely. Maggie has been pushed in the opposite direction from her father. She is more than any infant has any right to be. Homer and Maggie are the two poles of Springfield's mutation spectrum. He represents what environmental damage takes away. She represents what it gives, when it decides to give rather than remove. Same family, same house, same contaminated water, same irradiated air, same cracked cooling towers visible from the window of the house on Evergreen Terrace. Different outcomes, separated by a generation, pointing in opposite directions on the same scale. What is Maggie waiting for? Here is the question the show never answers, and probably never will. What is Maggie planning? Because the evidence suggests she is planning something. The silence is deliberate, the invisibility is maintained. The intelligence is real, and 36 years is a long time to be building towards something without having revealed what it is. We've seen what she can do in small scale. She can shoot a man. She can organize a group of infants into coordinated action. She can navigate complex environments under hostile conditions. She can outthink adults in situations that require real-time adaptive decision-making. She can read social environments well enough to know exactly when it's safe to act and when it isn't. She is the most capable member of the Simpson family. She has been the most capable member for 36 years, and she has spent all of that time maintaining a posture of helpless infancy that ensures no one takes her seriously or monitors her closely or considers that she might have an agenda. The family trusts her judgment implicitly in those moments when they remember to consult her at all. Homer has turned to Maggie in crises and received guidance that was correct. Marge has read something in Maggie's expressions that guided important decisions. Even Lisa, who is otherwise the most perceptive member of the household, has at times deferred to whatever Maggie communicates through her particular combination of gesture and silence. But nobody asks the next question. Nobody asks what Maggie wants. Nobody wonders what she's been thinking about for 36 years behind that pacifier and those enormous watching eyes. Springfield won't see it coming when Maggie finally acts at scale. She has made absolutely certain of that. And in a town where every overt challenge to the existing order gets neutralized, where Lisa's visible intelligence gets dismissed, where Mona's activism got her exiled, where truth-tellers get tied to trains and sent away, operating in perfect invisibility might be the only strategy with any chance of actually working. Maggie is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably, she cannot speak beyond a handful of sounds, and she might be the most quietly powerful entity in Springfield. She just hasn't decided what to do about it yet. Section 6. Mona Simpson and 3 generations of damage. The mother who was always alive. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official family history. Abe Simpson told his son that his mother had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned her, or more precisely, he integrated the loss into his personality in the way children integrate early losses, by building his character around the wound she left. The result is everything specific and painful about Homer Simpson as a person. His desperate need for approval, his clinginess toward Marge, which masks a terror of abandonment that runs deeper than any of his other emotional tendencies. His compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him, even people who treat him with contempt. His willingness to endure years of humiliation and degradation from his employer rather than risk losing the stability his job represents. His inability to advocate for himself in any sustained or effective way. Homer's personality is not simply the product of limited intelligence. It's the product of a childhood shaped by the conviction that he was the kind of person whose own mother would rather die than stick around for. That specific wound, the belief that maternal love is something you can lose through some fundamental inadequacy of your own, generates a particular kind of adult. Someone who holds on too hard to what they have. Someone who expects to be left. Someone who accepts treatment from others that no one should accept, because the alternative, being alone, being abandoned again, seems worse. In Season 7, the episode Mother Simpson revealed that the grave Abe showed Homer belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Homer's mother had never died. She'd been alive the whole time, living as a fugitive, unable to return to Springfield, unable to contact her family, unable to be the mother she clearly wanted to be. And the reason she couldn't come home connected directly to a name Homer knew very well. Mr. Burns. The Biological Weapons Lab. In 1969, Mona Simpson was a housewife in Springfield. She was married, she had a young son. Her life was ordinary in every way that the lives of young mothers in suburban America in 1969 were ordinary. And then the world outside her kitchen window, which was burning through the civil rights movement and the counterculture and the protest movements against an increasingly unpopular war, reached her. She became involved with a group of activists. The show describes them, with the shorthand of its era, as hippies, but their cause was specific and their target was real. They were focused on a facility in Springfield that had been overlooked in the general public discourse about what Charles Montgomery Burns was doing in their town. Not the nuclear power plant. Something else. A biological weapons laboratory. Burns didn't just own a facility for generating nuclear energy. He owned a germ warfare research installation, a laboratory designed to develop and stockpile biological agents, in the same community where families were raising children and people were going about the ordinary business of their lives. This isn't presented in the show as a minor detail or a period-specific subplot. It's presented as something specific about what Burns was doing with his resources during a particular era, and the fact that it was happening in Springfield, with the implicit reach it would have had on the community surrounding it, is not incidental. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They detonated an antibiotic bomb, which destroyed the biological agent stockpiled inside. During the chaos of the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, a man who would later become Springfield's chief of police, Clancy Wiggum. The raid was successful, the weapons were neutralized, but as the group fled, Mona made one mistake. In the confusion, someone fell, and Mona, who had gone to that laboratory to stop harm from being done to people, stopped to help the person who had fallen. The person who had fallen was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI, and from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. The price of one mistake. She couldn't go home. She couldn't call Abe and explain. She couldn't hold her son or be there for his childhood or watch him grow into whoever he was going to become. She had to disappear, completely and permanently, into an underground life that was safe enough to keep her free from federal prosecution, but that required her to surrender everything she actually wanted. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping. He was 6 years old. He didn't wake up, and then she was gone. Abe told Homer his mother had died, perhaps because the truth, your mother is a fugitive from federal law enforcement because she destroyed the biological weapons lab owned by your future employer, was too complicated, too dangerous, too likely to put Homer in a position he couldn't navigate safely. Or perhaps because Abe, who was dealing with his own grief and his own limitations as a parent, found the lie simpler than the truth. Or perhaps because Burns had made clear, in ways the show only gestures toward, that discussing Mona's continued existence would create problems. Whatever the reason, Homer grew up knowing his mother was dead, and everything that Homer is, everything that makes him simultaneously lovable and infuriating, capable of great love and great selfishness, desperately seeking connection while being chronically incapable of the introspection required to maintain it, all of it is shaped by that lie. Burns's long game. Here is where the conspiracy deepens past the individual tragedy and into something structural. When Mona returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He spots her through the window of a cab. He calls the authorities. The FBI shows up at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer, who has just found his mother after 27 years of believing she was dead, has to say goodbye to her a second time. And this time he knows why she left. He knows who is responsible. He knows that the man who made his mother a fugitive, who kept her underground for 27 years, who forced her to miss his childhood and his adolescence and his marriage and the births of his children, is the same man who signs Homer's paycheck every 2 weeks. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns for his entire adult life. Homer earns his livelihood from the man who destroyed his family. And Homer cannot make this connection in any sustained or actionable way. He doesn't quit. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't do the thing that any person with a fully functioning capacity for emotional processing would do when they discover that their employer is the person who inflicted the defining childhood trauma of their life. Homer goes back to work on Monday morning, and it is not played as callousness or cowardice, but as the cognitive and emotional limitation of a man whose brain doesn't work well enough to draw lines between adjacent facts. The radiation, the crayon, the decades of living in a contaminated environment that has been gradually degrading the cognitive function of everyone inside it. Homer's inability to connect the dots is not a character flaw. It's a symptom. And Burns, who has known about this connection all along, has never once done anything to draw Homer's attention to it. The deal that explains everything. The show confirms in a later season that Homer's inexplicable job security has a structural explanation. Burns committed a crime. Grandpa Simpson, Abe, discovered it. Rather than face any consequences for that crime, Burns struck a deal with Abe. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a permanent position at the power plant. No matter how many mistakes Homer made, no matter how egregiously he failed at the job's basic requirements, no matter how many documented errors accumulated in his employee file, which the show suggests is extensive enough to be genuinely alarming, Homer would not be fired. 742 documented errors. Homer is still employed, because the deal protects him. The deal between his father and his mother's persecutor, struck in secret, maintained in silence, never explained to Homer because explaining it would mean explaining everything else. Your mother is alive. She's been alive the whole time. She has to stay underground because the man you work for identified her to federal law enforcement after she destroyed his illegal biological weapons laboratory. Your father knew this. Your father made a deal with this man to keep you employed. Your entire adult life has been structured by an arrangement made between two men who each had secrets they needed to keep, using you as the currency. Homer never receives this explanation. He just goes to work. What Burns stole. Burns didn't just take Homer's mother. He took Homer's potential. The episode that removes the crayon from Homer's brain demonstrates this explicitly. Without the crayon, Homer is brilliant. He's articulate. He's capable of understanding the systems operating around him. He can see Springfield for what it is. He can recognize the architecture of his own situation. He is, briefly, the person he might have been if he had grown up with a mother who stayed in a town where the environment didn't damage him, without a foreign object suppressing his cognitive function for his entire life. That Homer is miserable in Springfield because intelligence is a burden in a place that punishes it, and eventually he chooses to put the crayon back. He chooses stupidity because the alternative is unbearable. But the choice was never really free. Homer didn't choose to be cognitively limited. The crayon was put in his brain as a child, either through accident or through the kind of negligence that looks like accident from a sufficient distance. The radiation exposure began before he was old enough to consent to living in Springfield. The emotional damage from his mother's absence began at age 6, before he had any framework for processing it. The man Homer could have been, the brilliant, articulate, perceptive man who emerges briefly when the crayon comes out, existed in potential from the beginning. Burns didn't just run that man's mother out of town. He spent 30 years, through the power plant's contamination and the healthcare system's negligence and the economic grip that kept Homer dependent on his employment, ensuring that the potential never developed into anything that could threaten him. Homer is not a casualty of fate. Homer is the product of a system that needed him exactly as he is, and Burns designed the system. 3 generations? Count the damage across generations. Grandpa Simpson, a man who knew the truth about his wife's continued existence and chose the lie, who made a deal with the person responsible for destroying his family and convinced himself it was the best available option, who raised a son to believe his mother was dead, and who spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of that choice in a retirement home that Burns also, in a later storyline, destroys. Homer Simpson, a man whose childhood was shaped by the loss of a parent who wasn't actually lost, whose cognitive function was diminished by a combination of brain damage and environmental contamination, who spent his entire adult working life employed by the person responsible for the defining trauma of his childhood, and who cannot connect these facts because the system that produced them also damaged the mechanism required to recognize them. Marge Simpson, who married into this without knowing any of it, who built a family on a foundation of secrets she didn't know were there, who has devoted decades of her life to holding together a household built on damage she can't see because it happened before she arrived. The children, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, all born into Springfield's contaminated environment, all inheriting the emotional and biological consequences of the 2 generations that preceded them. Burns won. Burns always wins in Springfield. Because in Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. And the rules say Homer Simpson will work at the power plant until he dies. Because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a mistake, because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 7, The Predictions Phenomenon. The show that keeps being right. There is a peculiar and ongoing cultural phenomenon surrounding The Simpsons, one that has grown more prominent in the age of social media and shows no signs of diminishing. The Simpsons, a cartoon sitcom that began airing in 1989, has apparently been accurately forecasting events in the real world for over 3 decades. The internet treats each new instance of apparent prediction as though it has discovered a fundamental mystery of the universe. Screenshots circulate. Clips go viral. People who haven't thought about the show in years suddenly find themselves asking the question that the phenomenon always generates. How did they know? Let's look at what the show has actually appeared to predict, because the catalog is genuinely impressive when you see it assembled. In the year 2000, the episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future version of Springfield in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president of the United States. During the episode, Lisa references the financial mess left by her predecessor. The predecessor is identified, with complete specificity, as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the presidential election in 2016. In 1995, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functions as a communication and information tool, something that resembles what we would now recognize as a smartwatch, years before the concept of wearable technology had entered mainstream public discourse. In 1994, Homer went to space aboard a NASA mission in an episode that treated commercial space tourism as a joke about the absurdity of the future. That future arrived. In 1998, Homer stumbled into a mathematical equation during a donut-based thought experiment, and the equation, which appeared on screen, has been examined by actual mathematicians and found to approximate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wasn't experimentally confirmed until 2012. The writers appear to have gotten within a plausible range of a fundamental physics constant, 14 years before the physics community verified its value. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposed a theory about the shape of the universe based on his observation that everything good is donut-shaped, and years later, cosmologists examining radiation patterns in the cosmic microwave background found evidence suggesting the universe might actually have a toroidal topology. Homer's donut theory is not obviously wrong. In 1993, an episode called Marge in Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, generating mass panic, overwhelming the healthcare system, causing runs on essential supplies at stores, and resulting in desperate searches for treatment options. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During the episode's fictional outbreak, the townspeople accidentally release a swarm of killer bees while trying to find a cure. In 2020, during the actual pandemic, Asian giant hornets were discovered in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. The internet called them murder hornets. In 1996, the show included a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed a concert with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The joke became reality 28 years later. In 1998, the show depicted an entertainment conglomerate absorbing smaller media companies in a merger that resulted in a single entity controlling a vast portion of American entertainment. The specific merger depicted involved a company that resembled Disney absorbing a company that resembled Fox. In 2019, Disney acquired 20th Century Fox for approximately $71 billion. The list continues. Video calling technology, autocorrect failures, mass surveillance culture, specific sporting events, political developments, scientific discoveries. The show has been right, or appeared to be right, about a remarkable range of things over a remarkable span of time. The official explanation. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons since its earliest seasons, has addressed the prediction phenomenon with characteristic directness. His answer is this: if you throw enough darts, you're going to get some bullseyes. That's it. That is the complete official explanation. Volume and probability. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak seasons, expanded on this slightly. He noted that there are very few cases where The Simpsons can be genuinely said to have predicted something, that most of what gets labeled as prediction is coincidence, and that history has a tendency to repeat itself in ways that make old content look prescient when it's actually just describing cycles that recur. Fact-checking organizations have gone through many of the most popular claimed predictions systematically and found that most of them are not as precise as they initially appear. The details are adjusted in social media posts to make the match look closer than it is. The framing of the original episode is omitted in ways that change its meaning. The timeline of what the show depicted versus what actually happened is sometimes significantly less dramatic than the viral version suggests. And the volume argument is genuinely compelling. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, extrapolations from current trends, and comic exaggerations of real-world situations. When you generate that much content across that much time, statistical probability alone guarantees that some of it is going to align with future events. The question is not whether some predictions will come true. The question is how many. The writing staff also brings significant analytical firepower to bear on American culture. The show has historically employed writers with degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite universities. Multiple writers have backgrounds in mathematics, physics, computer science, economics, and political theory. These are not people who guess at random about where society is headed. They are trained observers of human behavior and social systems who have spent careers identifying patterns in how American culture moves and where it tends to go. They didn't predict Trump's presidency. They noted that Trump had been publicly testing a presidential run since the late 1980s, that celebrity politics was a trend rather than an aberration, and that the logical comedic extreme of the existing trend was a reality television personality running for and winning the highest office in the country. They didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. They observed that media consolidation was accelerating, that large entertainment companies were systematically absorbing smaller ones, and that a single massive conglomerate controlling American entertainment was where the existing trend lines pointed. They didn't predict smartwatches. They noticed that technology was getting smaller and more personal with each product cycle and imagined the next logical step on that trajectory. Where the explanation gets complicated. The volume and probability explanation accounts for most of the predictions. It is probably sufficient to explain the majority of what gets labeled as prophetic content in the show's catalog. But it doesn't explain all of it. Some of the apparent predictions are specific in ways that probability and trend extrapolation don't fully account for. The Trump prediction didn't just forecast celebrity politics or even a specific celebrity. It named Trump by name, showed him in a specific context, and the visual language of the episode's depiction aligns with real images from Trump's actual campaign announcement in ways that go beyond generic coincidence. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers during a Las Vegas show. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically and permanently injured during a performance when one of the act's white tigers attacked him. The episode didn't just predict that wild animals are dangerous. It described a specific type of event involving a specific type of animal in a specific type of performance context. At some point, the precision of certain coincidences starts to feel like more than coincidence, even knowing that confirmation bias is doing significant work in how we perceive and remember the hits versus the misses. Which brings us to the most interesting theory about the prediction phenomenon. Not the one that says the writers are time travelers, and not the one that says it's all coincidence. The one that says The Simpsons isn't predicting the future at all. It's shaping it. The cultural influence theory. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most thoroughly embedded pieces of media in American cultural history. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand their own culture. Its jokes have entered the language. Phrases from the show have become idioms. Characters from the show have become archetypes that people use to describe real people and situations they encounter in daily life. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people encounter it. It becomes a reference point. It primes the cultural imagination for the possibility it describes. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like a shocking impossibility and more like an inevitable punchline to a joke the culture has already heard. When the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to what the show depicted, the audience doesn't experience it as prediction. They experience it as recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The moment feels familiar because it was made familiar in advance. The show didn't predict Disney buying Fox. It made media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as obvious satire, as a thing so clearly coming that you could already make jokes about it. When Disney actually bought Fox, the cultural response wasn't shock. It was the particular form of recognition that the show had been cultivating for years. This is a genuine and measurable cultural phenomenon. Satire shapes expectations. Comedy primes perception. The most widely shared satirical content in a culture doesn't just comment on what's happening. It influences what the audience expects to happen, and expectations about what will happen influence the conditions under which things actually do happen. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has, over 36 years of close cultural proximity, started to resemble Springfield. The nuclear power plant with its corrupt management and its regulatory capture, and its safety violations hidden under paperwork. The ancient billionaire who controls the town's economy and escapes all consequences. The incompetent government that fails the people who depend on it. The population that is too distracted by its immediate circumstances to organize any sustained challenge to the systems that exploit it. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset, where enormous problems emerge and are addressed in ways that solve nothing structural and allow everything to return to normal until the next catastrophe. The Simpsons didn't predict any of this. The Simpsons described the America that already existed in 1989, pushed slightly toward its logical extremes, and then watched as the America it described gradually caught up to the description. Confirmation bias as the engine. Here's the mechanism that makes the predictions seem more numerous and more precise than they actually are. The Simpsons has made thousands of jokes and observations that have not come true. Predictions about jetpacks, about specific political outcomes that went differently than depicted, about technological developments that never materialized, about cultural shifts that moved in completely different directions from what the show anticipated. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares them. Nobody builds discussions around the predictions that failed because there is nothing interesting or memorable about a prediction that didn't come true. The internet's natural selective attention ensures that only the hits get remembered and circulated. The misses disappear into the archive of 800 episodes where they sit uncelebrated and unclipped. When you filter thousands of satirical observations through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created, which is social media, what you get is a highlight reel. And a highlight reel of accurate predictions from a show that has been running for 36 years and produced nearly 800 episodes will look to anyone encountering it without context, like prophecy. The predictions aren't supernatural. They're the natural output of a brilliantly written show, staffed by highly educated observers of American culture, running for an impossibly long time, producing more satirical content than any other show in television history, and then having that content filtered through confirmation bias until only the accurate predictions remain visible. But here is what stays with you even after you understand how the trick works. Even knowing all of that, even accounting for volume and probability and confirmation bias and the trend extrapolation skills of an educated writing staff, there are moments in the catalog that give you pause. Moments where the specificity is too precise, the detail too exact, the visual alignment too close to be comfortably explained by any of the standard mechanisms. Those moments don't prove anything, but they remind you that the line between a very good guess and something else is not always obvious when you're standing on the other side of it. And every time a new clip from 1,998 surfaces that seems to map perfectly onto something from this morning's headlines, that feeling returns. Not certainty, not supernatural conviction, just the particular unease of looking at a show that has been watching America for 36 years and wondering exactly how carefully it was paying attention. Section 8. The Principal and the Pauper: Springfield's Infrastructure of Denial. The episode that showed you the machine. Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper aired on the 28th of September, 1997, and it detonated inside the show's fanbase in a way that, nearly 3 decades later, has still not fully subsided. The backlash was immediate. It was intense. Critics and fans united in their condemnation. Harry Shearer, the voice actor behind Principal Skinner and several other significant characters, publicly stated his displeasure with the storyline. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the series. It's cited regularly as the moment the show lost respect for its own continuity, the moment the writers betrayed the audience's trust in Springfield's internal logic. But the people who hate this episode are reading its betrayal backwards. The episode didn't break The Simpsons. It diagnosed Springfield. It showed you, explicitly and clearly and in real time, the mechanism that makes every other strange and impossible thing about the show work. The machinery of collective denial. The infrastructure of agreed-upon forgetting. The social technology that Springfield has been using since its first season to maintain an impossible reality. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the ceremony, a stranger walks in. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. He explains, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, survived a POW camp, escaped, and returned to Springfield to find that someone else had been living his life for 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is an imposter named Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a street kid, a petty criminal with no family, no prospects, no sense of identity or belonging. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. And Tamzarian, who had never had a mother, never had a home, never had an identity worth keeping, simply went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took his name, his history, his family, his job, his entire life. And he lived inside that stolen identity for 20 years, building a career, building relationships, becoming a real person with real connections and real history under a name that didn't belong to him. Until the real Skinner came back. Springfield votes on reality. Here is where the episode does something extraordinary and revealing. Springfield holds a meeting. The real Seymour Skinner is present. Armin Tamzarian is present. The full truth has been laid out in front of everyone. Every resident of Springfield who has any interest in the situation knows, with complete certainty, that their principal is a fraud, that the man who has been running their school, living next door, participating in their community for 20 years, is not who he says he is. The town then votes, not on what to do about the fraud, not on whether to press charges or investigate further or restore the actual Skinner's identity and reputation. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to maintain the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that Armin Tamzarian is, henceforth and permanently, Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived years of captivity and came home to find his life occupied by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge makes it explicitly, legally, criminally prohibited to ever mention what actually happened, under penalty of torture. Let that settle. A town that knew the truth, had access to the evidence, had the actual victim of the fraud standing in front of them, voted unanimously to exile the truth and make honesty illegal. The pattern that was always there. Fans hated this episode because they read it as the show disrespecting its own continuity. If Skinner is actually Tamzarian, then everything we knew about Skinner was a lie. His Vietnam service, his relationship with Agnes, his history with Bart, his dynamic with every other character in the show. All of it built on a fiction that the writers invented in Season 9 and retroactively applied to the previous 8 seasons. That reading is understandable, but it misses what the episode is actually doing. The episode is pointing at something that has been true about Springfield since the beginning and saying it out loud for the first time. Springfield has always operated this way. Consider how many times the town has experienced events that should have permanently altered its reality. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It's been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It's been invaded. It survived nuclear near misses. It experienced the sun being blocked out by a billionaire's mechanical device. It has had encounters with forces and events that, in any functioning community, would generate sustained institutional response, investigation, changed policies, legal consequence, and after every single one of these events, by the next episode, everything is back to normal. Nobody references the previous catastrophe. Nobody acts differently in light of what happened. The slate is wiped clean. The community returns to its default state as though the event existed outside of time rather than inside it. Fans have been calling this episodic storytelling for 30 years. The show uses an anthology format where each episode is largely self-contained, and that's just how that format works. But The Principal and the Pauper offers a fourth explanation, and it's the one that makes Springfield most coherent as a place. Springfield resets because the community chooses to reset. Not passively, not through forgetting, but actively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says, we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as criminal, and anyone who breaks this contract will be removed from the community. The Principal and the Pauper isn't depicting something new about Springfield. It's depicting something old, explicitly, for the first time. Every time Springfield has forgotten a catastrophe or ignored a contradiction or returned to normal after something world-changing, this same mechanism was operating, off-screen, quietly, through the same kind of collective decision that plays out on-screen in this episode. The episode shows you the vote you never got to see happening all the other times. The infrastructure of maintained reality. Once you understand Springfield's denial as a structured, deliberate, community-maintained practice, rather than a quirk of episodic television storytelling, the specific categories of things that Springfield consistently chooses not to see become very informative. The three-eyed fish, the radiation from the power plant, the quality of the water, the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents that deviate from human norms, the way Burns doesn't age, or rather ages in a way that should make his age impossible, the complete absence of legal or regulatory consequence for 36 years of documented safety violations at a nuclear facility. The fact that the safety inspector responsible for that facility is demonstrably and catastrophically unqualified for the role. None of these things are secrets in Springfield. They're visible. People can see them. The three-eyed fish was national news within the show's universe. Burns's impossible age is visible to everyone who encounters him. Homer's incompetence is evident to every character in the show. The town just chooses not to follow those observations to their logical conclusions, because following them would create a chain of inference that ends somewhere nobody in Springfield can afford to go. If they acknowledge the radiation, they have to confront the power plant. If they confront the power plant, they have to challenge Burns. If they challenge Burns, the economy collapses. If the economy collapses, the town dies. So they don't acknowledge the radiation. They look at a three-eyed fish and they nod and they move on, and they vote, in whatever informal way communities vote for these things, to file that fish under the category of Springfield being Springfield, rather than under the category of evidence that their water supply is contaminated. The principal and the pauper made this mechanism visible because it had to make it explicit to construct its storyline. The other hundreds of episodes don't have to make it explicit because it operates in the background, beneath the surface, as the silent infrastructure that keeps Springfield's reality coherent. The exile of truth. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with proof. Unambiguous, irrefutable, personally embodied proof that the official narrative was a fiction. He didn't come with a conspiracy theory or a suspicion or an inference from circumstantial evidence. He came with his own existence, which was all the evidence required. "Here I am," he essentially said. "The story you were told about me is not true." And the town's response was not to thank him or to acknowledge what he'd proven or to investigate how the lie had been sustained for so long without detection. The town's response was to tie him to a railroad car, physically remove him from the community, and make it illegal to acknowledge that he'd ever been there. Truth was the threat. Truth was what needed to be expelled. Not the fraud, because the fraud had become too integrated into the community to be excised without tearing out things people needed. The truth teller was the problem, and the solution was exile. This is not a satirical exaggeration of how communities function. This is a fairly precise description of how certain communities do function. Small towns have a particular capacity for collective amnesia about inconvenient truths. Institutional scandals get buried and then forgotten and then denied in a sequence so practiced it barely seems deliberate. The official version accumulates enough weight and enough time behind it to become more real in a practical sense than the actual events it replaced. What Springfield does explicitly in this episode, with a legal decree and a town meeting and a formal vote, most real communities do through less dramatic but ultimately equivalent mechanisms. Social pressure, selective memory, the accumulated investment in a particular version of events that makes revising it feel more costly than maintaining it. Springfield is not unusual in this, it's just unusually honest about it. The coma connection. If the coma theory is correct, this episode takes on an even more specific meaning. Homer's unconscious mind, generating the dream of Springfield, invented a storyline where an entire community votes to maintain a lie because that is what Homer needs to believe is possible. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real through sustained collective agreement. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can replace the real one so completely that the real one becomes the threat and the fake one becomes the law. Because that's what his coma is. A fake life. A dream masquerading as reality. A version of Springfield that doesn't exist, sustained by Homer's mind, kept running by Homer's refusing to let it stop. And as long as nobody questions it, as long as the Dreamtown keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer never has to acknowledge that what he's living in is a dream rather than a life. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, exiled from his own existence. The last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. The episode that fans cite as the worst in the show's history is the only episode that shows you how the show works. And understanding how it works makes everything else make sense. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The town that exists everywhere and nowhere. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More Americans can name Springfield, home of The Simpsons, than can identify the capital of a significant percentage of actual American states. And yet, despite 36 years of episodes, despite thousands of scenes set in its streets and parks and schools and bars and churches, nobody can tell you where it is. Not which state, not which region, not which part of the country. Springfield does not exist on any map that corresponds to the American continent as it actually exists. The town has oceanfront property. It also has mountains. It also has desert. It also has farmland. It also has forests. It also has Arctic conditions and tropical heat waves. often within the same television season. It borders the states of Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. It is located simultaneously in the American heartland and on the coast, near the Canadian border, and near Mexico, in a southern climate and a northern one. No place that actually exists has all of these geographic features. Springfield is physically impossible. The show has been deliberately contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time a detail appears that seems to narrow the possibilities, a later episode introduces a detail that makes the earlier one irrelevant. Lisa's area code is consistent with Missouri. The state abbreviation has appeared on screen as NT, which is not a real American state. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities while leaving most viable candidates intact. Springfield is depicted as being near enough to Shelbyville to have a long-running rivalry with it, but Shelbyville's location is equally undefined. The show teases answers and snatches them away over and over, with a consistency that begins to feel less like production error and more like editorial policy. The creator's confession. In 2012, Matt Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine and said something that appeared to settle the question definitively. He said he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, the city near where he grew up. He chose the name because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America, existing as a municipality in nearly every state, which meant it could plausibly be located anywhere. And the real Springfield, the one in Oregon, was the one he was thinking of when he invented the fictional one. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be resolved. Then the show continued. Episodes aired after the interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts that were clearly incompatible with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. They kept making the same contradictions. They maintained the same deliberate impossibility, and it became clear that the interview had answered one question while leaving the actual mystery intact, because the mystery was never really about which specific real-world city Groening was thinking of when he invented Springfield. The mystery is about why the show has spent 36 years making the town's location impossible to determine. That answer Groening didn't give. The geographic impossibility as comedy. The surface explanation for Springfield's geographic incoherence is the one Groening himself has provided. Springfield is meant to feel universal. By being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, it can resonate with viewers in every part of the country. It's the town you grew up in, regardless of where you actually grew up. Every viewer can find something in Springfield that maps to their own experience of American community life, because Springfield contains enough geographic and cultural variety to accommodate most of those experiences. This is probably true as a design principle. The writers and creators have confirmed it in various forms. Springfield's universality is a feature of its design, not an accident of its production. But the radiation theory suggests something additional. If Springfield's environment has been fundamentally altered by decades of radioactive contamination from the power plant, if the biology of its residents has been mutated, if the very physical reality of the town has been warped by what Burns has been doing there for a century, why should geography be exempt from that warping? A town whose residents have 4 fingers and yellow skin and physiological characteristics that don't occur in normal human populations is a town where the rules of biology no longer apply in standard ways. If the rules of biology are suspended, if the physical reality of living organisms in Springfield operates according to different principles than it does everywhere else, there's a coherent logic to the idea that the physical landscape of Springfield might also operate according to different rules. Maybe Springfield has both mountains and oceans, because the contamination doesn't just affect living things, maybe it affects the physical structure of the region itself. Maybe decades of radioactive runoff and atmospheric contamination from the plant have produced a localized distortion of geographic reality, compressing features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible space. This sounds strange, but so does a three-eyed fish. The Dream Atlas. Under the coma theory, Springfield's geographic impossibility is even more elegantly explained. Homer's dreaming mind doesn't have a precise, accurate mental map of the American continent. It has impressions, fragments, emotional associations with places he's visited or seen or imagined. The mountains from a childhood vacation, the ocean from a commercial he saw on television, the desert from a movie, the farmland from driving through the Midwest on a family trip. Dreams don't have geographic logic, They have emotional logic. You don't dream about a place because it's geographically adjacent to another place. You dream about it because it carries some emotional weight, because it connects to something you were thinking about, because your mind pulled it from storage and placed it where the dream needed a landscape. Homer's unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered or imagined, layering them on top of each other without regard for where they actually are in the physical world. The result is a place that contains everything Homer associates with America, all of it simultaneously accessible, none of it at the accurate distance from anything else. Springfield feels like America not because it accurately represents any specific American place, but because it's built from Homer's memory of America, and Homer's memory is full of American things even if the spatial relationships between them are completely wrong. The jurisdictional shield. And then there's the theory that's more cynical and more structural than either of those. If Springfield has no fixed location, it has no fixed regulatory authority. A town that sits definitively in California falls under California's environmental regulations and California's state attorney general and California's EPA district office. A town that sits definitively in Ohio falls under Ohio's equivalent authorities. A town with a fixed location has a fixed set of oversight bodies with jurisdiction over what happens within its borders. Springfield floats between states. Its jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. The regulatory apparatus that should be holding the nuclear power plant accountable can't establish clear authority over a facility in a town that doesn't exist in any consistent legal geography. The state attorney general who might investigate burns has to first establish which state they're the attorney general of, relative to Springfield. The EPA regional office that should be monitoring the contamination has to determine which region it's in. Springfield's geographic uncertainty isn't just a comedy device. It's a liability shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed accountability, no permanent oversight, no consistent enforcement, no regulatory body that can establish unambiguous jurisdiction over what Burns has been doing to the water supply for 36 years. The town keeps floating because landing means someone shows up with a badge and a subpoena and starts asking questions that don't have comfortable answers. The clue that changes its answer. In the 12th season, a mockumentary episode called Behind the Laughter pulled back the curtain on the Simpsons as though they were a real family whose lives happened to have been adapted into a television series. During this episode, Springfield's location is finally revealed. In the original broadcast, the family is described as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns of the same episode, the location has been changed to a different state. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you're watching. Springfield has a definitive location that changes based on the platform through which you encounter it. The show gave you the truth, and then quietly changed the truth depending on the context, and in doing so demonstrated precisely why it has been able to maintain the geographic mystery for so long. Even when Springfield has an answer, the answer doesn't stay. This is not a production error. This is an editorial decision. Someone made the choice to change the stated location between the original broadcast and the syndicated version. That decision was made by people who understood the value of maintaining the ambiguity, who saw a definitive answer in the original broadcast as a problem to be corrected rather than a mystery to be resolved. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show can't decide, but because the show decided long ago that Springfield is more useful as a question than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town that can't be shut down by the regulatory apparatus of any particular state, because no particular state has successfully established jurisdiction over it. The mystery serves everyone in Springfield except the people who are being poisoned. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Nobody ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1 year old in 1989. She is 1 year old in 2025. Homer and Marge were roughly in their mid-30s when the show began, and they remain in their mid-30s now. 36 years have passed in the world outside the television. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. The show's present is always the viewer's current present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When episodes aired in 1995, the characters were living in 1995. The year changes, the technology changes, the cultural references change, but the characters don't. They exist in a state of temporal suspension, locked at the ages they were in the fall of 1989, cycling through decades of American life without accumulating any of the time those decades represent. Most people who watch The Simpsons accept this without deep examination. It's how animated shows work. It's how episodic television works. Character ages don't advance because advancing them would eventually require ending the show. The floating timeline is a production convention, not a narrative mystery. Except The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so enormous and so structurally strange that they've started to crack the foundations of the show's internal logic. The problem of the origin story. When the show began, Homer and Marge's backstory was anchored to a specific era. They met in high school. They fell in love in a setting defined by the cultural atmosphere of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Homer's hair in flashback scenes, Marge's prom dress, the music playing in the background, the cultural references embedded in their early history. All of it placed their formative years in a time period that made sense for parents who were in their mid-30s in the late 1980s. But as the floating timeline pushed the present forward, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they didn't meet in 1980. They met somewhere around 2005. Their high school experience wasn't shaped by Watergate and disco. It was shaped by MySpace and early YouTube and the cultural context of the early 2000s. The show has handled this by simply rewriting the backstory whenever a flashback episode requires it. In later seasons, Homer and Marge's youth has been updated to include references to the 1990s, then to the 2000s, then to the 2010s. They were grunge fans. They were hipsters. They were millennials, more or less, at least in terms of when they came of age. The characters are the same. The love story is the same. The era keeps sliding forward because the timeline demands it. What this means is that Homer and Marge don't have a fixed past. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a permanent present. Their origin story is not a settled fact in the show's canon. It's an approximation, rebuilt as needed, discarded when it becomes too dated to serve its narrative function. Their memories are unstable. Their personal histories are liquid. They exist without the foundation of a fixed past, which means the only thing holding their identity stable is the present moment they're currently living in. Remove the present, and there's nothing beneath it but a series of increasingly outdated origin stories. Every theory meets here. Every theory discussed in this exploration converges on this point. The coma theory, the radiation theory, the collective denial theory, the Burns immortality theory. All of them arrive at the same conclusion through different paths. Time doesn't work in Springfield. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. His dreaming brain cannot imagine his family growing older because he wasn't there to see it happen. They stay the same age they were on the day he lost consciousness, because that is the only age his memory has for them. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the biological mutations caused by decades of nuclear exposure have altered the cellular mechanisms of aging at a fundamental level. The contamination has damaged the biological clock that normally governs how living organisms move through time. The residents of Springfield are not just yellow and four-fingered. They are biologically frozen, suspended at their current ages by the same contamination that gave them all the other strange characteristics the show presents as normal. The collective denial theory says nobody ages because Springfield has agreed not to acknowledge the passage of time, the same way it agrees not to acknowledge the contamination and the fraud and the corruption and all the other things that would be too costly to confront. Time passing means consequences accruing. Consequences accruing means accountability. Accountability means the system has to answer for what it's been doing. So the town votes, in its quiet, unspoken way, to let time float, to never arrive at the moment where someone has to answer for the past. The Burns immortality theory says at least one person in Springfield has already demonstrated that aging is negotiable, that the normal relationship between biological life and the passage of time can be interfered with through sufficient wealth and medical technology. If Burns can do it, and he's been doing it for over a century, then the concept of aging is not a natural law in Springfield's universe. It's a default that can be overridden. All of these theories are describing the same phenomenon from different angles. Something is wrong with time in Springfield. Not in the sense that time travel is involved or that the physics of the universe have been violated in some gross way, but in the sense that the normal passage of time through biological systems, through memories, through the gradual accumulation of experience that we call growing older, doesn't function the way it does everywhere else. Springfield is a place where time sticks, the glimpses of what could have been. The show has demonstrated, across multiple episodes, that it can imagine its characters aging. It simply refuses to let them. In the season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show presents a flash forward to a future where Lisa is 23 years old, engaged to be married, navigating adult life with the particular combination of intelligence and loneliness that the show has always suggested she'd carry into adulthood. The episode is detailed and emotionally rich. The future it depicts feels earned, the natural extrapolation of the character we've been watching. Lisa grown up is recognizably Lisa, with the same values and the same struggles and the same saxophone, but grown. And then she returns to being 8 years old. The flash forward ends. The future is sealed behind the closing credits. Lisa is 8 again when the next episode begins. Multiple other episodes have done similar things. Treehouse of Horror segments have depicted aged versions of the characters. Satirical flash-forwards have suggested futures for Bart and Lisa that feel plausible and emotionally coherent. The show clearly has the imaginative capacity to picture its characters developing through time. It chooses not to let them. The choice is deliberate. The floating timeline is not a production limitation. It's a creative decision maintained across 36 years by writers who understood that allowing the characters to age would change the fundamental nature of what the show is. What the freeze actually means. Here is the thesis hiding inside the floating timeline. The Simpsons is the American family, not an American family among others. The American family specifically and definitively, in the way that cultural icons occupy positions that feel more general than they should. Homer and Marge, and Bart, and Lisa, and Maggie are not just characters, they're archetypes. They represent something about what family means in the American imagination that has proved durable enough to survive 36 years of changing culture without losing its resonance. And the American family, as The Simpsons has been depicting it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must remain middle-aged, because a retired Homer suggests an America that has moved past the era of blue-collar suburban life that he represents. Marge must remain patient and present, because her patience is the center of gravity that holds the family together, and a version of the show where Marge has given up on that patience would be a fundamentally different statement about American family life. Bart must remain rebellious and 10, because an adult Bart who has had to reckon with the consequences of rebellion would require the show to take a position on what rebellion is actually worth. Lisa must remain idealistic and 8, because a grown Lisa who has found out what the world actually does to people who hold her values would require the show to deliver a verdict on those values that it has been deliberately avoiding for 3.5 decades. Maggie must remain silent, because whatever Maggie represents when she finally speaks, whatever she becomes when she grows into the extraordinary intelligence she's been carrying behind that pacifier, that becoming would be a conclusion. And the show doesn't want a conclusion. The moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart graduates from elementary school and Lisa goes to middle school and Maggie says her second word, and Homer ages into his 50s and Marge gets her first gray hair, the show stops being a comedy and starts being an elegy. The story of something that ended. The record of a time that passed. America doesn't want that story. America wants the Simpsons to always be there. On the couch, in the living room, on Sunday nights, exactly as they've always been. Because as long as they're there, unchanged and unchanging, the version of America they represent hasn't ended either. The loop that we built. The floating timeline is not a trap the show built for its characters. It's a trap the audience built for the show. The Simpsons keeps running because we keep watching. The characters don't age because we need them not to age. The timeline floats because we are the ones holding it up, keeping it suspended above the ground of normal temporal reality, not letting it land because landing means ending. Consider what it means for someone who was a child when The Simpsons premiered to watch the show now. That person is in their 40s. Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8. Homer is still the age he was when he was the age of your parents. As long as the show continues, as long as Bart is still 10 and the couch gag still plays and Homer still works at the plant, those viewers can hold on to something. Some connection to the version of themselves that existed when the show began. some access to the feeling of being the age they were when Bart felt like someone worth emulating. Letting The Simpsons age means admitting that time has passed, that the people who watched the premiere are now significantly older than the characters they watched, that the world depicted in those early episodes, however satirically, is gone, that the Springfield of 1989 is historical now, an artifact, the same way that all the eras the show's flashback episodes have revisited are historical. The floating timeline is the show's way of refusing to become history. And it works because we let it. We tune in every week, or every time we open the streaming service, and we confirm through our attention that the loop is valid. That the same family on the same couch, in the same house, in the same impossible town is worth returning to. That Bart's skateboard and Lisa's saxophone and Homer's donut and Marge's blue hair are things worth seeing again. And every time we confirm it, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the show to escape into the linear time that would give its characters a future. We press pause a little more firmly on the moment that started in December 1989 and has, in our imagination, never quite ended. Springfield as a mirror. All 10 theories explored in this script, the radiation contamination, the coma dream, the unsolved shooting, the immortal billionaire, the strategic silence of the infant genius, 3 generations of deliberate damage, the prediction phenomenon, the infrastructure of collective denial, the geographic impossibility, the frozen timeline, all of them are saying the same thing in different registers. Springfield is broken. Something about it doesn't work the way the world outside it is supposed to work. Biology, time, memory, accountability, geography, none of it operates according to normal rules inside Springfield's borders. And the show has been telling us this, quietly and consistently, across every episode, every season, every decade of its existence. Not through dramatic reveals or carefully planted mystery boxes that get resolved in season finales, through accumulation, through the patient, repetitive 36-year layering of detail upon detail until the picture becomes impossible to ignore if you're paying the right kind of attention. The fish have 3 eyes. The safety inspector is brain damaged. The billionaire is 140 years old and glows in the dark on Thursdays. The town forgot the dome. The principal isn't the principal. The baby is the most dangerous person on the street. The mother who died didn't die, and the man who drove her out is the one writing your paycheck. These are not Easter eggs. These are not random background details for eagle-eyed fans to collect and share. These are the components of a coherent picture that the show has been assembling in plain sight for 36 years. Springfield isn't hiding its mysteries. It's showing them to you every single week. It's just that nobody in Springfield can see them because the town won't let them look. And nobody watching can see them because we've been watching for so long that we've accepted the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who won't die as simply how things are around. Here, they don't have to be. The theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and refused to accept the surface. They dug, they connected, they held adjacent details next to each other until the lines between them became visible. And what they found is a version of the show that is stranger and sadder and more internally coherent than the cartoon comedy it presents itself as. A version where Homer's stupidity is a scar left by a system that broke his family before he was old enough to have any say in it. Where Maggie's silence is the most sophisticated response to Springfield's environment that anyone in the family has managed. Where Burns's immortality is what unchecked power looks like when it has enough time and enough money to engineer its own continuity. Where Marge's patience is the load-bearing wall of a structure that would collapse without it. Where Bart's rebellion is the only honest response to a world that has stopped making sense and keeps insisting it hasn't. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and fundamentally alone, keeps asking questions that nobody wants to answer because she's the only person in Springfield who hasn't stopped looking. The question we can't answer. After everything, the biggest mystery of The Simpsons is the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? We know the show is a loop. We know the characters don't age because we won't let them. We know Springfield is impossible. We know the theories, all of them, and we know what they mean. And we know that knowing what they mean doesn't change anything about how we feel on Sunday evenings when the theme plays. Maybe the answer is that the show is us, not as we are now, but as we remember ourselves being, preserved in the amber of a particular era of television, accessible whenever we need to access it. Homer is the father we had, or the father we wanted, or the father we were terrified of becoming. Marge is the patience we aspire to and the loneliness we sometimes recognize. Bart is the version of us that wanted to be brave and funny and untouchable. Lisa is the version that wanted to be heard. And Maggie is the version we keep to ourselves. The one that watches everything and says nothing and waits for the right moment to speak. Maybe we can't let them go because letting them go means admitting that the couch we sat on as children, watching that opening sequence for the first time, is in a landfill somewhere now. That the world has moved on from wherever it was when the show premiered. That we are considerably older than we felt sitting on that couch, and that the sensation of being young enough to believe Springfield was the whole world is not something we can get back by watching another episode. As long as The Simpsons is running, as long as Bart is 10 and the couch gag plays and Homer stumbles through the door after another day at the plant, we don't have to fully reckon with that. We can sit down, turn on the television, and go back to Evergreen Terrace. To the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. Springfield will be there when you fall asleep tonight, and it will be there when you open your eyes in the morning, exactly as you left it. The kids young, the beer cold, the cooling towers cracked, the billionaire glowing somewhere in the dark, waiting for you, because that's what Springfield does. It waits. And the loop goes on. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield with me tonight. If you made it this far, you've earned it. If you drifted off somewhere around Burns's medical regimen, you'll pick it up again next time. Get some rest. Springfield will still be here. It always is. End of script. Total sections, 10. Estimated word count, 42,000 plus. Bonus section 1. Homer and the nature of violence. The man who strangles his son. There is something sitting right at the center of the show's visual vocabulary that everyone has accepted for so long it's become invisible. Homer Simpson strangles Bart. He does it regularly, reflexively, with both hands around the boy's neck, accompanied by a guttural sound that the show uses as a repeated comedic beat across hundreds of episodes. The strangling is a running gag. It is probably the most repeated physical action in the show's history that isn't a couch gag variation. And it is, when you look at it directly rather than through the accumulated filter of decades of normalization, the depiction of a father physically assaulting his child. The show knows this. The show has always known this. The joke only works because the audience has been trained to receive it as harmless, as something that belongs in the category of cartoon slapstick, rather than in the category of things you would call concerning if you witnessed them in a real household. The violence is stylized. The hands around the neck are cartoonishly oversized. The reaction is comedic rather than realistic. And Bart's responses to being strangled are themselves played for humor rather than for distress. But underneath the stylization is something worth examining. Homer's violence toward Bart is almost always impulsive. It's reactive. Something triggers Homer's frustration or anger or sense of humiliation, and the physical response happens before any cognitive intervention can redirect it. There is something that looks like a learned pattern in the speed of that reaction, the way it bypasses whatever filtering mechanism should exist between feeling and action, the way it's so automatic and so reflexive that it registers in Homer's behavior as almost involuntary. The radiation theory has something to say about this. Chronic radiation exposure at the levels the show has established for Springfield, combined with the cognitive suppression Homer has been experiencing since childhood via the crayon lodged in his brain, would plausibly affect the neural circuits responsible for impulse regulation. The frontal lobe, already compromised by the crayon, is exactly the structure responsible for modulating emotional reactivity and preventing impulsive behavioral responses. Damage to it, from any source, tends to produce exactly the pattern Homer exhibits: intact emotional experience, compressed gap between stimulus and response, difficulty with inhibition. Homer isn't a bad man. The show is consistent about this, and it's one of the things that makes his character work despite everything. He loves his family with a completeness and an intensity that the show depicts genuinely and without irony. But his love and his violence coexist, and the violence is a symptom of something the show has been describing all along. The strangling is not a joke about domestic abuse. It's a joke about impulse control in a brain that's been damaged by the environment it's been living in since birth. That distinction matters even if the show never makes it explicit. The damage is real within the show's logic. The violence is its expression. And the fact that nobody in Springfield, including Bart himself, finds this alarming enough to address is another data point in the radiation theory's ongoing argument about cognitive damage and impaired critical assessment. The drinking. Homer's relationship with alcohol is another thing the show depicts so frequently and so casually that its implications have become invisible through familiarity. Homer drinks a lot. He drinks beer at Moe's Tavern with a regularity that, mapped onto real behavioral patterns, would constitute a significant dependency. The show has acknowledged this directly in episodes where Homer attempts to quit drinking and finds it unexpectedly difficult, where the withdrawal and the craving and the social ritual of the bar are all depicted with enough specificity to suggest the writers were describing something they understood. The radiation theory doesn't cause Homer's drinking, but it provides a context for understanding it. People who have experienced trauma, who live with chronic pain or chronic cognitive difficulty, who find the gap between what they sense about themselves and what they can express or accomplish too large to bridge, often self-medicate. Homer is a man who can occasionally glimpse the distance between what he is and what he might have been, in those brief moments when the fog lifts enough for him to see it, and the experience of that glimpse is, as the Crayon episode demonstrates, genuinely unbearable. The fog is, in its own terrible way, a kindness. The fog numbs the awareness of what it obscures. Beer is another form of fog, another way of not having to see clearly, another mechanism for maintaining the comfortable distance from understanding that makes Homer's existence in Springfield tolerable. The show treats Homer's drinking as a running joke and occasionally as a genuine character element, depending on the episode and the tone. Under the radiation theory, it's one more symptom of a system designed to produce exactly this outcome. A man who chooses numbness over clarity because clarity, in Springfield, costs more than most people are able to pay. Bonus Section 2. Lisa and the burden of seeing clearly. The smartest person in a town that punishes intelligence. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has an IQ that dwarfs everyone in her immediate family and most of the adults in Springfield. She is musically gifted in ways that go beyond childhood talent into something that adults with professional training would recognize as exceptional. She is morally serious in a community that treats moral seriousness as a social liability. She is intellectually curious about everything and capable of sophisticated engagement with ideas that her environment cannot support. And Springfield punishes her for it consistently, thoroughly, and without apparent awareness that anything unusual is happening. The pattern is established early and maintained throughout the show's run. Lisa identifies a problem. Lisa articulates the problem with precision and intelligence. The adults around her deflect, dismiss, redirect, or simply fail to process what she's saying. Springfield's institutional responses to Lisa's interventions are designed to manage her rather than engage with her. The school, the town government, the community broadly, they all have developed reflexive mechanisms for containing Lisa's challenges without actually responding to them. The radiation theory provides one explanation for why Springfield's adults are so systematically unable to engage with Lisa's intelligence. If chronic radiation exposure has compromised the critical thinking capacity of Springfield's population, the inability to follow Lisa's reasoning to its conclusions isn't willful dismissal. It's the cognitive consequence of decades of contamination. The gap between Lisa's reasoning capacity and Springfield's general population is partly a matter of her exceptional intelligence, but it's also partly a matter of the population's suppressed baseline. But there's another dimension to Lisa's isolation that the radiation theory alone doesn't capture. Even without the contamination, even in a hypothetical Springfield where everyone was cognitively unimpaired, Lisa would still face the specific difficulty of being exceptionally intelligent in a community that is organized around values that don't privilege intelligence. Springfield's social structure rewards belonging, conformity, the ability to participate in shared rituals, the willingness to subordinate individual perception to collective agreement. These are not unintelligent values. They're the values of a community that has found stability and cohesion and that correctly identifies certain kinds of individual deviation as disruptive to that stability. Lisa is constitutionally incapable of the subordination Springfield requires. She cannot look at the three-eyed fish and agree that it's not concerning. She cannot hear about the power plant's safety violations and decide not to think about them. She cannot look at the town's collective amnesia about its own history and accept it as normal. She sees clearly where others don't or won't, and she can't stop seeing just because the seeing is expensive. This is her greatest gift and her deepest wound. She is isolated not just because others can't follow her reasoning, but because she can't stop reasoning in ways that separate her from them. The intelligence is inseparable from the isolation. What Lisa wants. The show has spent 36 years depicting what Lisa wants, and the consistency of that depiction across decades of changing writers and showrunners is remarkable. Lisa wants to be taken seriously. She wants her intelligence to be recognized and engaged with rather than managed and redirected. She wants to live in a community that values what she values, that cares about the things she cares about, that would be capable of looking at Springfield's problems and responding to them rather than voting to forget them. She wants, in a word, to be somewhere else. The show depicts this clearly and with genuine compassion in episodes that flash forward to possible futures for Lisa, in episodes that show her finding brief communities of like-minded people before those communities dissolve or disperse, in episodes that follow her through moments of connection that don't last long enough to give her what she needs. Lisa is the character who makes the radiation theory most heartbreaking. If you follow the implications all the way down, she's the only member of her family who can see Springfield clearly enough to understand what it is. She is, cognitively speaking, the least affected by the environmental conditions that have impaired everyone around her. And her relative clarity means she lives with the full, unmediated weight of understanding what those conditions have done to her family and her community, without the protective fog that makes it bearable for Homer, without the strategic invisibility that makes it manageable for Maggie. Lisa sees it all. She always has. And the show never lets her do anything about it that actually changes anything, because changing things would end the loop. And the loop, as established in the floating timeline section, is not something Springfield allows to be interrupted. She keeps asking questions that nobody wants to answer. She keeps being the only person in Springfield who hasn't stopped looking. And that looking is both who she is and what it costs her to be who she is. Bonus Section 3. Moe's Tavern as a window into Springfield's social fabric. The bar that serves purposes. Moe's Tavern is the secondary gathering place of Springfield, second only to the Simpsons' living room in terms of how much of the show's story runs through it. And it's worth spending time on what Moe's represents within the social ecosystem the show has built, because the tavern functions as more than a setting. It functions as a diagnostic window into the particular kind of community Springfield is. Moe Sislak, the proprietor, is one of the show's more interesting recurring characters, precisely because he exists at the intersection of several of the show's themes simultaneously. He is deeply unhappy, consistently unhappy, in a way that the show depicts with periodic genuine poignancy amid the comedy. He's lonely in the specific way that people who have organized their entire social life around a single institution are lonely. Surrounded by people constantly, genuinely affectionate toward his regulars, and profoundly isolated in every way that actually matters. He cares about Homer and Barney and Lenny and Carl in a real sense, but the bar is not a community. It's a simulation of one. Moe has, across the show's run, attempted to escape the tavern and build something different for himself. He has pursued relationships that consistently don't work out. He has tried different career paths. He has occasionally had moments of genuine possibility that the show then collapses back into the familiar baseline of Moe behind the bar, unhappy, serving drinks, waiting for Homer to come in. The show has been honest about what the bar is for Homer and his friends. It's not primarily a social pleasure. It's a mechanism for managing the cognitive and emotional weight of their daily lives in Springfield. The beer numbs. The ritual of gathering creates a structure of belonging that doesn't require anything difficult from its participants. The bar is a place where you can be present without having to engage with what being present might require of you. Under the radiation theory, the bar's function is even more specifically interesting. A population that has been experiencing chronic cognitive impairment from environmental contamination would naturally gravitate toward mechanisms that reduce the experiential pressure of daily life. The specific combination of social ritual, alcohol, and low-demand interaction that Moe's provides is precisely calibrated to the needs of a population that is cognitively taxed by its environment and needs relief from that tax without having to address what's causing it. Moe's isn't just a bar, it's a pressure valve. It's what Springfield has instead of actually confronting the things that are making everyone's lives heavier than they should be. Barney Gumble and the Path Not Taken. Barney Gumble is one of the show's most quietly devastating characters, and he's deployed as comedy almost entirely, which is part of why his devastation goes largely unremarked. Barney is a drunk, a profound, all-consuming alcoholic who has spent decades at Moe's Tavern as the show's most recognizable background figure. He is the butt of the bar's humor. He is, in several episodes, depicted as Homer's best friend from childhood, someone Homer has known for as long as Homer can remember knowing anyone, which gives their relationship a depth that the show occasionally leans into before pulling back. And in an early episode, the show reveals what Barney was before the drinking. He was a promising young man with academic ability and a future. He and Homer were going to take their SATs together. Homer brought beer to the study session. Barney had never drunk before. The SAT became a beer session. And Barney's trajectory, whatever it might have been, bent irrevocably in the direction of Moe's Tavern. Homer gave Barney his first beer. The show presents this as a funny origin story for Barney's character. But what it's actually depicting is a before and after for a person. There was a version of Barney Gumble that didn't exist in permanent residence at the end of the bar. A version with academic promise, with a direction, with whatever would have come of those things if the study session had stayed a study session. That version was foreclosed by a beer, in an afternoon, when Barney was young enough that a single afternoon could determine the rest of his life. Under the radiation theory, Barney's arc fits the pattern of Springfield's general trajectory, the progressive foreclosure of potential through environmental conditions and their behavioral consequences. The contamination creates cognitive impairment. The cognitive impairment creates susceptibility to numbing mechanisms. The numbing mechanisms compound the impairment. The cycle continues until what's left is a man who has been living at the end of a bar for so long that the version of himself that existed before that study session afternoon feels like a story about someone else. The show gave Barney a brief recovery arc in a later season. He got sober. He became genuinely and movingly someone you could recognize as the person he might have been. And then the show almost immediately rolled him back to the alcoholic because the sober Barney didn't fit the ecosystem of the show. Springfield needs Barney at the bar. That's where Springfield keeps him. That's where Springfield keeps everyone. Bonus section 4. Burns and Smith. The relationship that runs everything. What Smithers actually is? We've talked about Smithers as the maintenance schedule for Burns's longevity, as the logistical infrastructure that keeps the medical protocol running. But Smithers is more than that, and the show has spent decades developing the complexity of what he actually represents within the show's ecosystem. Smithers has devoted his life to a man who will never love him the way he loves Burns, and the show has always been honest about this in the way that good, long-running television can be honest about a complicated truth without having to resolve it. Burns is not capable of loving Smithers. Burns is not capable of loving anyone in any ordinary sense. He is a man who has been alive for over a century and who has spent all of that time subordinating every relationship to the goals of his own survival and the expansion of his power. He has no one else. He has never had anyone else, except for a brief episode involving a woman named Gloria and a period in his youth involving a woman he genuinely loved who left, but those are exceptions in a very long pattern of absolute instrumental relationships. Smithers knows this. The show has made clear that Smithers understands what Burns is capable of and what he isn't, and chooses the relationship anyway. This is not stupidity. This is the specific kind of love that forms around impossibility, around someone who cannot give what you need from them, but who you love anyway, because the love is real regardless of whether it's reciprocated. The show has handled this with more grace than most observers give it credit for. It doesn't mock Smithers for his love. It doesn't treat the unrequited nature of it as a punchline beyond the surface jokes. At the level of character, Smithers's devotion to Burns is treated as something genuine and complicated, and ultimately rather sad. And under the Burns longevity theory, there's an additional dimension to what Smithers represents. Burns is, within the show's universe, approximately 140 years old, maintained artificially through weekly treatments, his diseases held in precarious equilibrium by controlled radiation exposure, his entire biological survival dependent on a schedule that has to be managed with precision. He cannot manage this himself. His physical capacity is too limited, and his cognitive availability for self-management is too variable. The management of Burns's survival requires an external party who understands the protocol completely, who prioritizes it absolutely, and who will maintain it indefinitely. Smithers is that party. He has always been that party, and the relationship between Burns and Smithers, whatever its emotional complications, is at its most basic level the relationship between a man who would die without maintenance and the person who provides that maintenance. This is not incidental to the show's exploration of power and dependency. It's the logical conclusion of that exploration. The most powerful man in Springfield is utterly dependent on the one person in his life who keeps him alive, and that person's leverage over Burns is the most significant leverage anyone in the show possesses. And Smithers never uses it. He never even acknowledges that it exists. Because Smithers' love for Burns is real enough that the leverage isn't leverage to him. It's just the architecture of a relationship he's chosen. The episode where Smithers runs the plant. In one episode, Burns is incapacitated and Smithers effectively takes over the management of the nuclear power plant. It doesn't go well, though for different reasons than you might expect. Smithers is extremely competent. He knows the plant's operations with the depth of someone who has been adjacent to its management for decades. He doesn't make the operational mistakes that the plant's general dysfunction might predict. But Smithers also doesn't have Burns's strategic ruthlessness. He doesn't have the specific willingness to sacrifice everything and everyone for the goals of the operation. He has ethics that Burns doesn't have, and those ethics create friction with the plant's actual operating model, which depends on not having ethics about certain things. The episode is played for comedy, but it reveals something interesting. The plant doesn't run the way it does because Burns is uniquely capable. The plant runs the way it does because Burns is uniquely willing. Willing to dump waste where it shouldn't be dumped? Willing to ignore violations that shouldn't be ignored? Willing to maintain an incompetent safety inspector because a competent one would shut the operation down. Smithers knows how to run the plant competently. Burns knows how to run the plant profitably, which requires running it incompetently on purpose. That distinction is the operational heart of the whole conspiracy. The plant is as dangerous as it is not because no one knows how to make it safer, but because the person who controls it has made a sustained, active choice not to. Bonus Section 5. Springfield's secondary characters and what they reveal. A town of trapped people. Springfield is populated by dozens of recurring secondary characters, and one of the things you notice when you look at them as a group is that almost all of them are trapped. Not just figuratively, not just in the existential sense that everyone in a loop is trapped, but specifically and personally in situations that they cannot leave and that the show maintains indefinitely without resolution. Chief Wiggum is incompetent at his job in ways that have real consequences for Springfield's residents, and the show occasionally acknowledges the genuine harm of that incompetence, while also using it as a comedy premise for dozens of episodes. He will never become competent. He will never be removed from his position. The cycle of Wiggum failing to do his job and Springfield absorbing the consequences will continue indefinitely. Superintendent Chalmers exists in a permanent state of barely managed outrage at Principal Skinner, now Tamzarian, now officially and legally Skinner again. He visits the school, he is appalled, he expresses his disappointment, he departs, he returns in the next relevant episode to do it all again. Nothing changes. The school's dysfunction is sustained. His response to it is sustained. The cycle continues. Dr. Nick, Springfield's most incompetent physician, practices medicine in a town where he is somehow both the first choice for desperate situations and the subject of ongoing legal liability without any of those situations ever resolving into actual consequences for his practice. He will never lose his license. He will never become competent. Springfield's relationship with him will continue in the same dynamic indefinitely. Sideshow Bob has escaped from prison more times than any rational assessment of Springfield's correction system would allow, and has attempted to kill Bart on a number of occasions that should have resulted in much longer sentences. He is in prison, then he's out, then he's attempting murder, then he's in prison again. The cycle runs. The pattern across all of these characters is the same pattern that runs through the show's primary storylines. People in situations they cannot leave, cycles that repeat without resolution, institutions that fail continuously without consequence, relationships that don't develop beyond their established dynamic. Springfield is a place where everything is stuck. Not just the floating timeline of the main characters. The entire ecology of the show is in stasis. The radiation theory says this is because the population is too cognitively impaired to organize the kinds of sustained challenges to the status quo that would change anything. The coma theory says this is because Homer's dreaming mind can't imagine things changing because he fell asleep before they did. The collective denial theory says this is because Springfield has chosen stasis, has voted for it, because the alternative is confronting what would need to change and why. All of them are pointing at the same quality of Springfield, a place where motion looks like motion but doesn't actually go anywhere, where events accumulate without producing change, where the loops spin and never quite open into anything that would let the story progress. Kent Brockman and the media that serves the loop. Kent Brockman is Springfield's primary broadcast journalist. He anchors the local news. He reports on the significant events that shape the community's shared understanding of what's happening in their world. And he is, across the show's run, essentially useless as a journalist. Not because he lacks ability. Brockman is depicted as having professional skill and genuine presence as a broadcaster. He is articulate, he is polished, he can clearly construct a news story when he has one. But the stories he constructs serve the loop rather than challenging it. When the three-eyed fish becomes news, Brockman covers it with the specific frame of interesting local story rather than evidence of ongoing environmental contamination. When Springfield experiences events that should generate sustained, investigative attention, Brockman covers the event as the event, not as the symptom of an underlying problem that requires ongoing examination. He provides the community with information in a format that satisfies the immediate need to know without building toward any conclusion that would require the community to do something about what it's learned. This is not necessarily cynical. Brockman may genuinely not see it. The cognitive suppression hypothesis of the radiation theory applies to journalists as much as to anyone else. A population that has been losing critical thinking capacity to chronic contamination includes its media professionals. The man covering the three-eyed fish may genuinely not have the cognitive resources to follow the story to its implications, because the contamination he's covering is also affecting the brain doing the covering. Or Brockman knows exactly what he's doing, and he's made a calculation that Springfield's media ecosystem rewards the kind of journalism that keeps the loop running, rather than the kind that might break it. Burns is an advertiser. Burns is an economic presence in Springfield that Brockman's employer depends on. There are structural incentives, familiar from real media economics, that would push Brockman's coverage in exactly the direction it goes. Either way, Kent Brockman is the media face of Springfield's collective denial. He tells the community what happened. He just doesn't tell them what it means. And that gap between event and meaning is where the denial lives. Bonus Section 6. The Treehouse of Horror and What It Gets to Say. When the rules suspend? Every Halloween since Season 2, The Simpsons has produced a special anthology episode called Treehouse of Horror. These episodes operate outside the show's normal continuity. Characters die and are resurrected. Impossible things happen that couldn't occur in the main timeline. The show is explicitly framed as non-canonical, a space where the writers can do things they can't do in regular episodes, because the horror anthology format provides a container for content the show's standard rules would otherwise prohibit. The Treehouse episodes are frequently cited as some of the show's best work, particularly in its early and middle seasons. And one of the reasons they're so good is that they give the writers a space to tell the truth about Springfield in ways the main show's format won't allow. The horror anthology frame lets the show externalize what the radiation theory describes as the internal condition of Springfield. A zombie invasion, a killer house, an alien abduction. These are metaphorical renderings of what is already happening in the main show, just stripped of the naturalistic framing that makes the main show's horrors invisible. Blinky the three-eyed fish is already a mutation. Springfield's residents are already physically abnormal. Burns is already something that has been alive too long through artificial means. The Treehouse episodes just get to be explicit about the horror, rather than having to embed it in sitcom comedy. The most interesting Treehouse episodes, in the context of the theories we've been exploring, are the ones that directly engage with questions of control, containment, and the manipulation of populations. A story about an alien invasion that controls the population through food additives. A story about a government conspiracy to turn Springfield citizens into slaves. A story about a figure of absolute authority who maintains his power through mechanisms the population can't see or challenge effectively. These are not random horror premises. They are the actual content of Springfield's ongoing situation, rendered in the explicit genre that makes the horror legible. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are what the radiation theory looks like when you take the naturalistic framing away and let the show say directly what it's been saying indirectly for 3 decades. The format gives the writers the freedom to externalize the contamination, to make the mutation visible, to let Burns be a monster without the deniability of comedy. The treehouse episodes are the show dreaming about itself, and in the dream, the horror is right there on the surface where everyone can see it. Because that's what dreams do. They take what's buried and put it somewhere you can look at it directly. Bonus Section 7. Grandpa Simpson and the Weight of Memory. The Last Living Witness. Grandpa Simpson is old. Not in the way Burns is old. Not impossibly, medically improbably old. But old in the way that real people are old. Old enough to have lived through things that no one else in the current world remembers firsthand. Old enough to carry the weight of a life that spans historical periods most people around him only know from books. He is also routinely dismissed as senile, as someone whose stories about the past are too confused and too contradictory to take seriously. As a background character who exists primarily to be warehoused in the Springfield retirement castle and occasionally retrieved for a subplot, but Grandpa knows things. Not in a specific, actionable, I have information that would change everything way, though he has sometimes had that too. More broadly, Grandpa has lived in Springfield long enough to have first-hand experience of the town before Burns fully consolidated his control. He was there for the eras the show depicts in flashback episodes. He knew Mona before she became a fugitive. He made the deal with Burns. He has been the living, memory-carrying witness to a version of Springfield's history that no one else in the current show has access to. And he can't communicate it effectively. The show's depiction of Grandpa's storytelling as wandering, repetitive, temporally confused, and difficult to follow is partly comedy and partly something more interesting. Because the unreliability of Grandpa's narratives doesn't necessarily mean the information they carry is unreliable. It means the information is trapped inside a mind that can no longer organize it and transmit it clearly. The data is there. The access mechanism is broken. Under the radiation theory, Grandpa's cognitive difficulties are consistent with a lifetime of exposure to Springfield's contaminated environment, potentially beginning before the nuclear plant, but certainly continuing throughout his residence in a town that Burns has been operating for decades. Whatever cognitive resources Grandpa started with have been eroded by time and by what time in Springfield does to a mind. But the things he carries in the eroded mind are real. The deal with Burns is real. His relationship with Mona is real. His experiences in the war, his experiences in the various eras of American life that he references with inconsistent but occasionally precise detail, all of it is real. Grandpa is Springfield's archive. A damaged archive, unreliable as a transmission mechanism, but still the only repository of certain information about what this town was before it became what it is now. And Springfield's relationship with Grandpa, the routine dismissal, the warehousing, the tolerance of his stories without any serious attempt to extract the information they contain, is consistent with the town's broader relationship with its own history. Springfield doesn't want to know what Grandpa knows. The information he carries would be too inconvenient. The memories he holds would require too much response. So he sits in the retirement home, telling stories that nobody fully listens to, while the town continues not knowing the things that would be most useful to it. The last living witness, warehoused and dismissed, his archive degrading year by year. Bonus Section 8. The show's relationship with death. A place where death doesn't stick. Hans Moleman is the show's most frequently killed recurring character. He has been hit by cars, crushed by objects, buried alive, eaten, incinerated, struck by lightning, and subjected to dozens of other fatal incidents in regular canonical episodes. He dies, and then he appears in the next relevant episode, alive, ready to die again. The show presents this as a running gag, and most viewers receive it that way. It's one of the show's longest-running background jokes, and it works precisely because of how thoroughly the show has committed to it over decades. Moleman dies constantly. It's funny, don't think about it. But within the framework of the theories we've been exploring, Moleman's repeated deaths are not just a running gag. They're the most extreme example of what the radiation theory describes as the alteration of normal biological rules within Springfield's contamination zone. Moleman has stated his age as 31 years old. He appears to be in his late 80s or 90s. Something has aged him catastrophically beyond his chronological years. Something that also apparently made him functionally unkillable despite his advanced apparent age and extreme physical fragility. If the radiation has altered biology within Springfield, in the ways the theory describes, if it has changed the rules of how living organisms age and heal and respond to physical trauma, then Molman is simply the most extreme case on the spectrum. Homer can survive physical damage that should be fatal. Molman can survive actual death. They're on the same continuum. The radiation's effects on biological systems scaled to their different exposures or their different biological responses to those exposures. The radiation theory's most optimistic reading of the Springfield mutation is that some people are enhanced by it. Maggie's cognition is amplified. Some residents demonstrate capabilities that exceed normal human parameters in various directions. Molman's is apparently biological immortality, or something functionally equivalent to it, paired with the dramatic acceleration of the aging process, and with extremely poor luck regarding the circumstances in which he finds himself. He is the oldest-looking 31-year-old in the world, unkillable by any mechanism the show has tried so far, existing in an endless cycle of death and resurrection that Springfield has accepted as background noise, the same way it's accepted everything else the contamination has produced. Death that matters. Against this background of death that doesn't stick, the deaths in The Simpsons that do stick, that are treated as real and permanent and consequential, stand out with particular force. Maud Flanders, Ned's wife. She died because Homer was dodging t-shirts being fired into the crowd at a car race, and the shirts hit Maud instead, and she fell from the bleachers, and that was the end of her. The show treated this death as permanent. Ned was left alone to raise his boys. The grief was real within the show's universe. The contrast between Molman's endless deaths and Maud's one permanent one is not arbitrary. The show is not being randomly inconsistent about which deaths count. What the pattern reveals is that death in Springfield has different weight for different characters, and the weight correlates with what the death is for. Molman's deaths are the show demonstrating the radiation theory in its most extreme form. Biology so fundamentally altered that death itself is reversible. Maud's death is the show demonstrating the cost that accumulates for the people around Homer, the genuine tragedy of living adjacent to someone whose particular set of needs and impulses and failures generates real harm, even when he means nothing but well. Homer didn't kill Maud maliciously. He didn't kill her at all, in the direct sense. He was just being Homer. And being Homer in the particular moment he was being Homer generated consequences for someone who couldn't absorb them the way Homer's immediate family has learned to absorb his consequences. That's the darkness the show rarely addresses directly, but that the radiation theory makes legible. Homer survives. Homer always survives. The show needs Homer to survive, and the coma theory says his own mind needs Homer to survive. But the people around Homer don't always survive the force field of his existence. Maud didn't. The show decided to make that real. Bonus Section 9. The town meeting as Springfield's central institution. Democracy in a contamination zone. Springfield holds town meetings with remarkable frequency. The community gathers, opinions are expressed, decisions are made, action is ostensibly taken. The town meeting is the show's primary setting for collective decision-making, and the decisions it makes are consistently, fascinatingly wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the town is villainous or malicious. Wrong in the sense that the decisions Springfield makes in its town meetings consistently fail to address the actual problems they're called to address, consistently prioritize immediate emotional satisfaction over sustained effective action, and consistently forget the context of previous meetings that would be relevant to the current one. The mob forms. The mob marches. The mob does something dramatic but not useful. The mob disperses. Nothing changes. The next episode, the next relevant crisis, the mob forms again. This pattern is comedic in execution and genuinely alarming in its implications. A community that is constitutionally incapable of making effective collective decisions about its own situation is a community that cannot protect itself from the things threatening it. Every town meeting is an opportunity for Springfield to challenge the power plant, to confront Burns, to take some coordinated action that would address the underlying conditions the radiation theory describes. And every town meeting ends without that happening, because the meeting dissolves into something easier, something more emotionally immediate, something that can be resolved within the duration of a single episode. The radiation theory says the population's cognitive impairment makes sustained, coordinated, long-term action impossible. You can't run an effective political campaign or mount an effective regulatory challenge if the cognitive function required for that kind of sustained engagement has been eroded by your water supply. The meetings happen. The energy is genuine, the frustration is real, but it can't be channeled into anything that would actually change the underlying situation. because channeling it would require exactly the kind of sustained, organized, logical engagement that chronic radiation exposure makes difficult. The meetings are Springfield's safety valve. They let the pressure out without doing anything that would address what's building the pressure. Bonus Section 10. Bart's Rebellion and what it's actually about. The kid who can't stop fighting. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. In that time, he has resisted authority, disrupted institutions, pranked adults, defied expectations, and generally operated as an agent of chaos within every system he encounters. The show presents this as a character trait, as the expression of Bart's particular personality, as the comic engine that drives his half of the show's stories. Bart rebels. It's what he does. It's who he is. But what is the rebellion actually doing? Under the radiation theory, Bart's rebellion takes on a different quality than it has as a simple character trait. Bart is growing up in a contaminated environment that has been designed, functionally if not intentionally, to produce compliant, non-questioning residents. The plant's contamination suppresses critical thinking. Burns's economic dominance creates dependency. The town's social mechanisms for handling inconvenient truths exile or marginalize the people who won't maintain the agreed-upon fictions. And Bart, by the accidents of his particular biology and his particular development, has retained enough resistance to authority to be a persistent irritant to every institution he encounters. He doesn't accept what he's told uncritically. He doesn't comply with rules that seem arbitrary. He makes life difficult for the systems that expect his cooperation. This isn't useful rebellion in any programmatic sense. Bart doesn't have a political consciousness or a theory of change. He just can't stop fighting. And the fighting doesn't change anything structural in Springfield's situation. But it's worth noting what Bart's rebellion costs him. The show depicts clearly and repeatedly that Bart's resistance to authority creates consequences for him personally. Academic consequences, social consequences, the exhaustion of a kid who has been fighting against everything around him for his entire life without any particular hope of winning. Bart is the kid who sees that something is wrong without having the language to articulate what it is or the tools to address it effectively. He responds to that perception the only way available to him, with chaos and disruption and the refusal to pretend that everything is fine. And Springfield responds to that refusal the way it responds to every challenge to its comfortable fictions, by trying to contain him, to redirect him, to manage him into something more compatible with the loop. The coma theory adds another dimension here. If Homer is dreaming, Bart's rebellion within the dream might be Homer's unconscious processing of his own suppressed resistance. Homer can't rebel against Burns. Homer can't challenge the system that's held him in place for decades. Homer's cognitive and emotional limitations make effective rebellion impossible for him. But in the dream, Homer can give his son the rebellious spirit he never had. Homer can let Bart be the thing he could never be himself, someone who won't simply accept the situation as given. Bart's rebellion is both who Bart is and, possibly, what Homer wishes he'd been. The 10-year-old who can't stop fighting is the father's dream of a different kind of life, projected into the child who will always be 10, always fighting, never surrendering to the loop. Final thoughts. What Springfield is. The show that watched America back. After everything, after all the theories and all the connections and all the questions without official answers, what emerges from spending this much time in Springfield is something specific about what the show has actually been doing for 36 years. The Simpsons has been watching America watch itself. It started as a comedy about a specific kind of family in a specific kind of town with specific kinds of pressures: economic, social, familial. The comedy was sharp and the satire was precise, and the show was genuinely great at what it was doing. Then it ran for longer than anyone expected, and the running changed it, and the changing revealed something about what it had always been. The show is a mirror, not a flattering one, a diagnostic one, the kind of mirror that shows you not what you look like, but how you work. The radiation theory is a diagnostic of how power operates within a community when the community can't effectively challenge it. The coma theory is a diagnostic of what grief does to the mind when grief has nowhere to go. The Who Shot Burns mystery is a diagnostic of how official narratives get constructed and maintained in systems that need closure more than they need truth. The floating timeline is a diagnostic of what America does with the things it can't bear to lose. The show found its deepest purpose in the gap between the comedy it presented and the darkness it contained. The jokes worked because they were funny. The show endured because underneath the funny, there was always something real being described. Something true about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary systemic conditions. Something honest about what it costs to be human in a world that isn't designed for human flourishing. Springfield is not just a fictional town, it's a functional model of a certain kind of community, a community under conditions that most communities recognize even if they don't fully articulate. The economic dependency on a single major employer. The regulatory capture that prevents effective oversight of that employer. The cognitive and social mechanisms that discourage effective challenge to the status quo. The media that covers events without building toward understanding. The institutions that manage problems without solving them. The population that finds ways to keep functioning within conditions that should produce more resistance than they do. These are not fictional conditions. These are recognizable conditions. That's why the show resonates after 36 years with people who have never lived anywhere near a nuclear power plant. Springfield isn't describing Springfield. It's describing the way power and place and community interact in ways that most communities experience, but few fictional worlds have the patience and the runtime to fully explore. The Simpsons had the runtime. It had 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, and the accumulated weight of all of that watching and all of that describing. And what it built, underneath the couch gags and the celebrity cameos and the rotating cast of hundreds of secondary characters, is something that deserves more credit than it usually gets for the depth of its observation. It watched America carefully for a very long time. It wrote down what it saw, and it trusted that eventually, if you looked closely enough, you'd see it too. That's everything. 4 hours in Springfield, 10 theories, plus everything that lives in the spaces between them. If you made it all the way here, thank you. If you fell asleep somewhere comfortable and woke up to silence, that's a good outcome too. Get some rest. Springfield will be here in the morning, exactly as you left it. That's the whole point. End of complete script. Extended deep dive. The economics of Springfield and why nobody leaves. A town that cannot release its people. One of the most persistent questions about Springfield that the show never directly addresses is the most obvious one. Why doesn't anyone leave? Springfield is, by any objective measure, not a good place to live. The water is contaminated. The air quality near the plant is presumably poor. The municipal government is incompetent. The economy is dominated by a single employer who treats his workers with something between contempt and indifference. The school system is underfunded. The crime rate, while played for comedy, appears to be high. The town has been physically damaged by catastrophes that, in a real community, would trigger mass relocation. The sun was once blocked out entirely, and yet the population remains. The residents of Springfield don't leave. They don't relocate to neighboring communities. They don't start over somewhere that isn't being managed by a century-old billionaire with 342 documented safety violations and a habit of using his position to suppress any challenge to his authority. Why? The economic explanation is the most accessible one and the most mundane. Springfield's economy runs on the power plant. Burns provides employment, directly through plant jobs and indirectly through the economic activity his enterprise generates, to a significant portion of the town's working-age population. The local business ecosystem exists to serve the population that the plant sustains. If the plant went away, or if Burns's control were meaningfully disrupted, the economic collapse would be swift and severe. There is no alternative employer of comparable scale. There is no diversified economic base that would cushion the impact. Springfield's economy is a company town organized around one company, and everyone in it knows, at least at the level of economic instinct, that the company is not actually something they can afford to challenge. This is not a fictional condition specific to Springfield. Company towns, communities organized economically around a single dominant employer, are a recognized feature of economic history, and the power dynamics they produce are well documented. The employer's leverage extends beyond the economic relationship between worker and company. It shapes the political environment, because the employer's interests dominate municipal politics. It shapes the social environment, because the employer's workforce forms the backbone of the community's social institutions. It shapes the cultural environment, because the shared experience of working for or depending on a single employer creates a cultural alignment with that employer's continued existence. Springfield is a company town. Burns is the company. And the town's relationship with him exhibits every characteristic of the company-town dynamic. economic dependency that prevents effective challenge, political capture that prevents regulatory response, social dynamics that stigmatize anyone who threatens the arrangement by threatening the economic stability that everyone depends on. The residents don't leave because leaving is harder than it looks from outside the loop. Their economic lives are tied to the plant. Their social networks are rooted in Springfield. Their identities are shaped by decades of living in this particular community under these particular conditions. Leaving means abandoning not just a place but a self, a version of your own story that exists only in relation to Springfield. And there's the radiation angle. If the contamination has been affecting cognitive function for long enough, the capacity to plan and execute a major life change like relocation might itself be compromised. The planning, the logistical complexity, the sustained motivation required to uproot your life and move somewhere new, these are exactly the kinds of cognitive tasks that chronic radiation exposure most affects. The ability to recognize that leaving would be beneficial might be present. The ability to organize and execute the leaving might not be. Springfield keeps its people not through walls or force, but through the accumulated weight of economic dependency, social connection, identity investment, and the cognitive effects of the environment they've been living in. The loop holds because the people inside it are, in various ways and to various degrees, equipped to maintain it rather than to escape it. The class structure nobody talks about. Springfield has a class structure that the show depicts with considerable clarity even while never explicitly naming it as such. Burns is at the apex, unambiguously by orders of magnitude, in a category by himself. Below him are the professional and managerial class. Dr. Hibbert, who is the town's most competent physician and is clearly financially comfortable. Sideshow Bob, before and between his prison terms, represented a kind of intellectual upper class. The Hibbert family, the Lovejoy family, the Wiggum family in terms of institutional position, if not financial prosperity. Homer occupies the solid middle class, or what used to be called the solid middle class. Homeowner, employed, benefits, pension, two-car garage, kids in school. The show has always been explicit about Homer's economic position as something that was achievable for someone with his qualifications in a certain era of American economic history, and that becomes increasingly precarious as that era recedes. The house, the car, the Duff beer, the bowling alley, the Quickie Mart, the Springfield tire fire, these are the landmarks of a specific American economic stratum that the show has been mapping for 36 years. And below Homer are the characters who are visibly struggling in ways that the show depicts with less comedy and more realism than its reputation sometimes suggests. Apu, who works extremely long hours in a job with no security and who faces regular discrimination and threat. The residents of the Springfield retirement castle, warehoused and underfunded. The characters who appear in the background of Springfield's economic difficulties, visible primarily when the show wants to remind you that not everyone in Springfield is doing as well as The Simpsons. The show understands class. It has always understood class. It comes from a tradition of American comedy that treats class as a central organizing feature of social life, rather than an embarrassing reality to be euphemized away. Homer's position in the class structure is not incidental to the show's story. It's the show's story. The economic conditions of Springfield's middle class, its vulnerability to the decisions made by Burns and the plant, its dependency on maintaining the employment relationship that provides its stability, these are the conditions that make everything else in the show possible. The radiation theory layers onto this economic foundation. The contamination doesn't affect everyone in Springfield equally. Environmental contamination in real communities tends to affect lower-income areas more severely, both because those areas are more likely to be located near industrial facilities and because they have fewer resources for mitigation and medical response. Springfield's class structure and its contamination patterns probably overlap in ways the show doesn't explicitly map, but that the theory suggests are real. Burns is protected from the worst effects of the contamination by his wealth and his medical infrastructure. His weekly treatments are expensive and sophisticated, unavailable to anyone without his resources. The affluent professional class probably has better access to cleaner water, better nutrition, more protective health practices than Homer and his neighbors in the working-class residential areas downwind of the plant. The contamination affects everyone in Springfield, but it probably doesn't affect everyone equally. And the people at the bottom of the economic structure, with the least resources for protection and the least political power to demand remediation, are probably the most affected. Springfield's class structure isn't just a social fact, it's a distribution mechanism for the consequences of Burns's operation. What prosperity looks like in a contamination zone. Homer's prosperity, such as it is, serves an interesting function within the radiation theory. Homer is comfortable enough. He owns his house, he has steady employment, he has health insurance, at least nominally. He has enough financial stability that the Simpsons' crises tend to be resolved within a single episode, rather than accumulating into the kind of compound catastrophe that genuinely trapped poverty produces. Homer is not poor by Springfield standards, and Homer's comfort serves Burns's interests precisely because it's real enough to be satisfying without being secure enough to be liberating. Homer has enough to lose that the prospect of losing it creates a powerful incentive for compliance. He can't afford to quit. He can't afford to make trouble. He can't afford to organize or to support challenges to the status quo that might disrupt the arrangement that provides his stability. He is economically comfortable enough to have something to protect, and economically precarious enough that protecting it requires continuous compliance with the conditions Burns sets. This is the specific sweet spot of economic dependency that company towns are designed to maintain. Too poor, and workers have nothing to lose from resistance. Too wealthy, and workers can afford to challenge the relationship. The stability point that maximizes compliance is exactly where Homer sits. Comfortable but dependent, stable but not secure. Burns didn't design this specifically for Homer, but the broad conditions that position workers in the stability point Burns needs were created by Burns, through the plant's operational structure, through the economic conditions Burns has maintained in Springfield, through the political arrangements that have prevented the development of any alternative economic infrastructure that might give workers somewhere else to go. Homer's comfort is not a benefit that Burns provides out of generosity. It's a mechanism of control that Burns maintains because it's cheaper than alternatives that might generate more effective resistance. The long view. Why Springfield will never change and why that's the point. The function of the unchanging town. Springfield cannot change. And not simply because it's an animated sitcom with a floating timeline. It cannot change because change would end what Springfield is for. What Springfield is for, in the show's deepest purpose, is to be a place that feels permanently present, a place that is always there, always in a recognizable condition, always available as a reference point for a culture that is changing faster than many of its members can comfortably process. The world outside the television has changed enormously in 36 years. The economic conditions of the American working class have changed. The political landscape has transformed multiple times. Technology has altered the basic texture of daily life in ways that would have been unimaginable when the show premiered. The cultural agreements that held American society together in 1989 have frayed and in some cases broken entirely. And through all of that change, Bart is still 10, Lisa is still 8, Homer is still at the plant, Marge is still patient, and the house on Evergreen Terrace is still standing in the condition it was in when we first saw it. Springfield's permanence is not a failure of ambition. It's the fulfillment of a specific function that the show discovered it could perform and that no other cultural institution performs in quite the same way. Springfield is stable when nothing else is. Springfield is familiar when everything else is changing. Springfield is home, or the cultural memory of home, in a world where home is increasingly difficult to maintain in either its physical or emotional sense. The loop is not a prison for the characters. The characters don't experience it as imprisonment. The loop is a service. It provides stability and familiarity and accessibility to millions of people for whom the world outside the television doesn't provide those things reliably. Every time the show resets to normal at the end of an episode, every time the catastrophe is forgotten and the family is back on the couch for Sunday night, it is performing a ritual of reassurance that its audience has come to depend on. This is why the radiation theory and the coma theory and the collective denial theory all arrive at the same emotional truth from different directions. Springfield's impossibility, its refusal to operate according to normal rules, its resistance to change and consequence and the passage of time all serve the same psychological function. They make Springfield safe. They make it permanent. They make it the one place in the cultural landscape that you can return to and find exactly as you left it. The show has been running for 36 years not despite its impossibility, but because of it. Springfield is impossible, and the impossibility is why we keep going back. The ending that will never come. There is an ending to The Simpsons that exists as a logical conclusion of everything the show has built. It's an ending the show will never produce. because producing it would end the function Springfield performs. In this ending, Homer wakes up, or Homer dies. Either way, the dream ends. And when the dream ends, the truth of Springfield becomes fully visible. The contamination is real and has been real the whole time. The mutations are real. The cognitive impairments are real. The economic dependency is real. Burns's control is real. The collective denial is real. Everything the theories have been arguing is not a theory, but a fact that the community has been maintaining through sustained, deliberate, collectively organized denial. And then something would have to happen. The truth being visible and undeniable, something would have to respond to it. Accountability would have to arrive, in some form, in some direction. Springfield would have to change. But Springfield changing would mean Springfield ending. The town that is stable when nothing else is, the place that is familiar when everything else is changing, the cultural home that millions of people return to because it's always there, would no longer be there in the same way. The loop would stop. The timer would start. Bart would be 11, and then 12, and then eventually an adult. And the boy who never grew up would grow up and become something the show would have to figure out how to be about. The Simpsons will never end that way. It will run until it is canceled or until the people who make it decide to stop, and it will run without resolving its mysteries or confirming its theories or letting its characters age or allowing the loop to open into anything that would give it a conclusion. Because the function Springfield performs requires the show to keep running. The stability it provides requires the loop to keep spinning. The home it offers requires the door to always be open, the couch to always be there, the kids to always be young. And so it will continue. 37 seasons, then 38, then however many after that. Bart will skateboard past the same buildings. Lisa will play the same opening notes on her saxophone. Homer will work at the plant. Marge will be patient. Maggie will watch everything and say nothing. And the loop will go on. It has to, because somewhere there is a man in a hospital bed in Springfield General, dreaming his family as they were on the last day he knew them, refusing to let the story end, holding them in place with the last of whatever cognitive function he has left. And as long as we keep watching, we keep the dream alive. We press pause. We hold the moment. We sit down, turn on the television, and go back to Evergreen Terrace. And the loop goes on. Thank you. Final end of script complete. Extended section. Sideshow Bob and the intelligence Springfield rejects. A man who keeps coming back. Sideshow Bob is one of the most interesting recurring figures in the show's long history. Not because of what he does, which is mostly attempt to kill Bart and get sent back to prison, but because of what he represents within Springfield's ecosystem. Bob is brilliant. Genuinely, demonstrably, uncomfortably brilliant in a town where intelligence tends to either go unnoticed, like Maggie, get punished, like Lisa, or get eroded, like Homer. He holds multiple advanced degrees. He speaks multiple languages. He has a comprehensive knowledge of opera, literature, classical music, and the kinds of cultural production that Springfield has no infrastructure to appreciate or support. He is, by almost any measure of conventional intellectual achievement, the most accomplished person in Springfield's recurring cast outside of Burns himself. And Springfield uses him as a clown. Before his villain arc began, Bob was Krusty the Clown's sidekick, a man with his education and his capabilities, wedged into a supporting role in a children's comedy show, wearing oversized shoes and taking pies to the face for the entertainment of Springfield's children. The humiliation of that position is something the show acknowledges periodically, and it's genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. Bob didn't end up as Krusty's sidekick because he lacked better options. He ended up there because Springfield doesn't have better options to offer someone like him. There is no university. There is no research institution. There is no cultural organization capable of engaging Bob's capabilities at the level they deserve. Springfield has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire, a quick E-Mart, and a children's television show. For someone of Bob's intellectual formation, the television show is arguably the most intellectually stimulating environment available. He becomes a villain, because villainy, in its particular way, is the only enterprise in Springfield that scales to his capabilities. Planning elaborate schemes, executing complex operations, maintaining the kind of sustained, sophisticated strategic thinking that his intelligence demands, these things are available to him in criminality in ways they're not available to him anywhere else in Springfield's legitimate economy. Bob's obsession with Bart isn't just personal, it's structural. Bart is the thing that keeps returning Bob to Springfield, keeps pulling him back into the loop, keeps his intelligence engaged with the specific problem of the 10-year-old boy who keeps defeating him. Without Bart, Bob might leave Springfield entirely. With Bart as his fixed obsession, Bob is trapped in the same loop as everyone else, cycling through the same pattern of scheme, failure, imprisonment, and return, unable to break out even though he's smart enough to see the loop clearly. He is, in a specific way, the most self-aware character in Springfield about the nature of his own trap. He knows he's in a loop. He knows the loop is maintained by his obsession with Bart. He continues anyway, because the intelligence that lets him see his trap clearly is also the intelligence that makes Bart an irresistible problem. And problems are what Bob's mind requires. Springfield rejected Bob's intelligence when it cast him as a sidekick. Bob rejected Springfield's rejection by becoming a villain. And the result is a man whose exceptional capabilities are perpetually deployed in the service of a vendetta against a child, in a loop that will never resolve, in a town that will never value what he actually is. He is, in his own way, as trapped as anyone else in Springfield, just more aware of the walls. Extended section. The marriage at the center of everything. Homer and Marge and why it works. The Simpsons is, underneath all the theories and all the mysteries and all the darkness the analysis reveals, a love story. Not a simple one, not a comfortable one. A sustained, complicated, imperfect, genuine love story between two people who chose each other in the specific circumstances of their particular lives and have kept choosing each other across 36 years of cartoon marriage. Homer and Marge should not work. On paper, the relationship makes very little conventional sense. Homer is cognitively impaired, emotionally volatile, physically reckless, financially irresponsible, and constitutionally incapable of the sustained thoughtfulness that most relationship advice would suggest is necessary for long-term partnership. He forgets anniversaries. He makes decisions without consulting Marge. He creates problems faster than she can manage them. He is, by objective measure, an extremely difficult person to be married to. And Marge is exceptional. That's the word the show keeps returning to when it depicts Marge clearly. Exceptional. She is patient in ways that go beyond simple temperament. She is emotionally intelligent in ways that Homer cannot access and that their children benefit from enormously. She is capable and competent and organized, and, in the episodes where she's allowed to be, genuinely talented, she could have built a different life. The show has been honest about this across multiple episodes, where Marge explores what her capabilities might have produced in a different context. She chose Homer. She keeps choosing Homer. And the question of why, which the show has addressed directly in many of its most emotionally serious episodes, turns out to have a genuinely interesting answer. Marge sees something in Homer that the rest of Springfield cannot see, and that Homer himself mostly cannot see, and that the cognitive damage and the radiation exposure and the crayon and all of it have mostly covered over. The person Homer could have been and occasionally still is. The person who is, underneath the damage, genuinely loving and genuinely trying and genuinely present with his family in ways that matter even when they're accompanied by enormous chaos. The love is real. The show has always been clear about this. In its most honest episodes, it depicts the Homer-Marge relationship with a directness and a specificity that comedies rarely achieve because it understands that the relationship is the emotional foundation on which everything else is built. If you don't believe Homer loves Marge, the show doesn't work. If you don't believe Marge loves Homer despite everything, the show doesn't work. You believe both because the show earns both, repeatedly, in the specific details of how these two people are together. The way Homer reaches for Marge's hand, the way Marge laughs at Homer's jokes even when they don't land, the way they return to each other after the fights and the disasters and the episodes where the marriage is stressed to its limits, the way the house on Evergreen Terrace is, despite everything, a home because these two people made it one. What the coma theory does to the marriage. If the coma theory is true, if Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then every moment of the marriage we've watched since then is Homer's unconscious mind reaching for Marge across the distance of unconsciousness. He can't hold her. He can't talk to her. He can't tell her where he is or if he's coming back. He is somewhere else, somewhere unreachable, and all he has is the dream of her, her voice, her patience, her specific way of saying his name that sounds different from how anyone else says it. So in the dream, he keeps her. He keeps her exactly as she was on the day he last saw her. Her hair still blue and impossibly tall. Her eyes still patient. Her voice still the voice he knows. He creates situation after situation in the dream where they fight and reconcile and find each other again, because the cycle of conflict and return is how Homer's mind keeps the marriage active, keeps it present, keeps it from settling into the static perfection that would feel too much like losing her. The fights in the dream are Homer's way of staying married. If the marriage were too perfect, it would feel like memory rather than presence. The friction keeps it alive. The return after the friction keeps it real. Every episode where Homer and Marge's relationship is tested, every episode where they fight and find their way back to each other, is a dreaming man refusing to let his marriage end, refusing to let her become just a memory, keeping her present and active and real in the only way still available to him. That's the coma theory's most devastating implication. Not that Homer is dying, not that Springfield isn't real, but that everything we've watched across 3 decades of this marriage is an act of love from a man who can't reach his wife any other way. He dreams her. Every week he dreams her, and she's always there when the episode ends. Extended section: Springfield's religion and the God who chooses sides. A town that takes God seriously. Springfield is, for a fictional animated community, unusually religiously active. Church attendance is a regular feature of the show's week. Reverend Lovejoy ministers to a congregation that includes most of the show's principal characters. Religious observance is woven into the background of Springfield's life in a way that distinguishes it from many American fictional communities, which tend to treat religion as either a comedic target or a background element too uncomfortable to engage with directly. The Simpsons engages with it directly. It has been doing so since the early seasons, in episodes that take theological questions seriously enough to actually argue about them. Homer's conversations with God are not one-directional performances by a distant deity. They're dialogues. God has opinions. God has preferences. God is, within the show's universe, a character, an actual present entity in Springfield's world rather than a symbolic or metaphorical one. And God, as we noted in the Ned Flanders section, talks to Homer. Not once, not as a freak occurrence, but multiple times across the show's history. Homer has had more direct divine communication than any other character in Springfield, including the devout people who have organized their lives around seeking it. This is the show's sharpest theological observation, delivered with the casualness that makes the show's best ideas land harder than they would if they were announced. The relationship between faith and divine attention, in Springfield's universe, is inverse. The people who try the hardest to be worthy of God's notice don't get it. The person who least deserves it, by any conventional moral accounting, gets it freely and repeatedly. Reverend Lovejoy is a man who has lost his faith. The show depicts this explicitly in an early episode. Lovejoy became a minister from genuine conviction, but years of ministering to Springfield's congregation, years of being the recipient of Ned Flanders' constant spiritual questions and anxieties and needs, have worn his faith down to something that looks more like professional habit than genuine belief. He goes through the motions. He preaches, he ministers, but the fire is gone. Ned has the fire. Ned's faith is genuine and total and completely sincere in a way that Lovejoy's isn't anymore. And God, within the show's universe, is silent toward Ned while being casually conversational with Homer. The show is making a point about something. Not necessarily a theological point in any doctrinal sense, but a point about the nature of the relationship between goodness and reward in the specific ecosystem of Springfield. The ecosystem doesn't work by conventional moral logic. It works by the logic of the radiation theory, the coma theory, the collective denial. In that logic, virtue is not protected, and faith is not answered, and the people who try the hardest to live correctly are not the people the universe visits. Homer gets God because Homer is the dreamer. If the coma theory is right, Homer dreams God the way he dreams everything else, and God shows up in the dream because Homer needs to believe that someone is paying attention to him. Not to Ned, not to Lovejoy, to Homer specifically. In the dream, God is on his side. That's not theology. That's a lonely man's heart expressing itself in the only language available to it. Extended section: The Quick E-Mart and the town's relationship with Apu. Convenience and its costs. The Quick E-Mart is Springfield's most important commercial institution after the nuclear power plant, and Apu Nahasapi Mapatalan is one of the show's most significant recurring characters. His relationship with Springfield is one of the show's most sustained explorations of what it costs to belong to a community that accepts you conditionally. Apu works extraordinarily long hours. The Quick E-Mart is open essentially all the time, and Apu is there essentially all the time, serving a community that depends on the store completely while treating Apu himself with a range of attitudes from casual acceptance to casual cruelty. He has faced discrimination, threat, and the specific indignities that come with being a visible minority in a community where visible minorities are rare. He has built a life in Springfield, married, had children, established himself in the community's economic and social fabric. But the fabric doesn't hold him with the same security it holds the people who have always been part of it. Apu is Springfield's most visible example of conditional belonging. He is welcome insofar as he serves the community's needs. His presence is tolerated because the Quick E-Mart is essential. But the acceptance is contingent in ways that Homer's or Marge's or even Ned's is not. The radiation theory applies to Apu too, but with a different valence. If the contamination has been running longer than Apu has been in Springfield, his exposure is recent relative to lifetime residence. The cognitive effects that the theory describes as characteristic of Springfield's long-term population may be less pronounced in Apu, which could explain his visible competence and intelligence relative to many of his neighbors. But the contamination he has been exposed to since his arrival is real, and the economic conditions that keep him working 100-hour weeks in a convenience store are the same conditions Burns's monopoly has created for everyone. The Quickie Mart is both Apu's livelihood and his trap. It's the institution that gives him a place in Springfield. It's also the institution that keeps him there, running, serving, available, with very little time or resources to build anything outside of it. Springfield needs the store needs Apu. And Apu, whatever he might have built in different circumstances, is what the Quick E-Mart needs him to be. The loop takes everyone, even the people who came from outside it. Extended section. What the show is actually saying about America. 36 years of observation. The Simpsons has been making a sustained argument about America since 1989, and the argument is not comforting, but it is, for the most part, honest. The argument goes roughly like this. The American middle class exists within a system that requires its compliance to function, and that system has developed very sophisticated mechanisms for obtaining that compliance without appearing coercive. The mechanisms include economic dependency that makes resistance too costly, cultural institutions that normalize the conditions of the dependency, media that covers the symptoms without addressing the causes, community structures that manage dissent rather than responding to it, and the specific comfort of belonging to something stable, something familiar, something that feels like home even when home is not entirely safe. Springfield is where this argument lives. Burns is the system's visible face, the clearest embodiment of the concentrated power that the argument describes. Homer is the system's primary product, a person of genuine warmth and love and occasional capability, shaped by the system's conditions into something that serves the system's needs rather than his own. Marge is the system's emotional infrastructure, the labor of care and maintenance that keeps the family functional across all the chaos the system produces, largely unacknowledged and rarely rewarded. Lisa is the argument's conscience, the person who sees what's happening clearly enough to articulate it and who is consistently blocked from doing anything about it. And Maggie is the argument's hope, the person who is watching everything, who is absorbing all of it, who is waiting for the right moment, who has not yet revealed what she knows or what she intends to do with the knowledge. The show has never stated this argument directly. It doesn't need to. It has been building the case scene by scene and episode by episode for 36 years. The case is in the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and Homer's job security and the deal Grandpa made with Burns and the vote to exile the real Skinner and the immunity Maggie has from prosecution and the silence of God toward Ned. The case is Springfield, and the case is us, watching Springfield every week, accepting the yellow skin and the four fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who won't die and the loop that won't open, normalizing all of it, becoming the people who look at everything the show depicts and say, well, that's just how things are around here. Because that's what the show has always been asking, not whether you can see what's wrong with Springfield, but whether you can see what it has to do with you. Whether Springfield is a place you're watching from the outside or a place you've been living in all along without quite realizing it. The answer the show suggests? Quietly and persistently across 3.5 decades of jokes and callbacks and continuity errors and running gags and celebrity cameos and couch gags and treehouse horrors and whatever comes next, is that there is no outside. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is everyone. The loop runs wherever people are willing to maintain it. And the question is not whether it can be broken. The question is whether you want it to be. That's Springfield. That's all of it. Get some rest. Truly final end of script. Extended section. The sounds of Springfield and what they carry. A town with a soundtrack. Springfield has a sound. Not just the show's iconic Danny Elfman theme, which is one of the most recognizable pieces of television music in history, but a texture of ambient sound that the show has been layering into its world since the very beginning, and that functions, if you pay attention to it, as another kind of evidence about what Springfield is. The nuclear plant hums. It's a background presence in the episodes set near it, a low, persistent sound that establishes the facility as part of the oral fabric of daily life in Springfield. The residents who live near the plant have been hearing that hum for decades. Their children have grown up with it. It has become as unremarkable as traffic noise, as invisible to conscious attention as the sound of one's own refrigerator. But it's there. And if the radiation theory is right, what that hum represents is the machinery of the contamination, running continuously in the background of everyone's daily life, producing the conditions that the theory describes while remaining just below the threshold of conscious attention. The show has always been careful with its sound design in ways that critics of its animation quality rarely acknowledge. The voice performances in particular are among the most precise in television history. The specific texture of Homer's voice when he's genuinely moved versus when he's performing emotion, the way Marge's voice shifts slightly when she's suppressing something versus when she's expressing it directly, the specific comedic rhythms that the show's ensemble has developed across decades of working together until the performances have the quality of genuine ensemble intimacy. These sounds are the texture of the dream, if the coma theory is right. Homer's mind populated Springfield not just with faces and places, but with voices, the specific auditory signatures of the people he loves, preserved in the dream with the fidelity of genuine memory. Marge's voice in the dream sounds like Marge's voice, because Homer's mind holds it with that specificity, with the precision of something you have heard so many times that it lives in you at a level below conscious retrieval. The Simpsons theme plays at the beginning of every episode. It has played at the beginning of nearly 800 episodes. It is one of the few pieces of music that virtually everyone in the contemporary English-speaking world can identify in the first 3 notes. And what it does every time it plays is signal a return to Springfield, a return to the family, a return to the loop. You hear those notes and something in you responds with recognition, with the specific pleasure of returning to something familiar, with the relaxation of being somewhere you know. That's what the music is for, not just to identify the show, but to activate the particular quality of attention that Springfield requires, which is a relaxed, receptive, slightly suspended attention. The attention you bring to somewhere familiar, the attention you bring to home, the silence beneath the sound. But underneath all of it, underneath the hum of the plant, and the music and the voices and the ambient sounds of a community going about its daily life, there is a silence that the show never fills. It's the silence of the questions nobody asks, the silence where the investigation into what the plant is doing to Springfield should be happening but isn't. The silence where the conversation about why everyone in Springfield looks the way they do should be taking place but doesn't. The silence where someone should be looking at Mona Simpson's story and asking what it reveals about Burns and asking what that revelation should mean for everyone who works for him. The silence is the collective denial made audible. It's the sound of a community that has agreed, tacitly and thoroughly, not to say certain things. Not because everyone has been explicitly told not to say them, but because the social environment makes saying them costly and not saying them comfortable, and the path of least resistance is always toward the comfortable. Lisa breaks the silence sometimes. She says the things that the silence is holding down, and Springfield manages her the way it manages every disruption to its chosen quiet, with distraction, with dismissal, with the gentle but firm redirection of attention towards something less destabilizing. The silence is the show's most honest moment, the space where everything it's been describing lives, contained and maintained and kept from becoming too loud to ignore. You can hear it if you listen for it. Underneath the music, underneath the voices, underneath the hum. It's been there the whole time. Extended section. The couch gag and the nature of ritual. What happens before the show? Every episode of The Simpsons begins the same way. The clouds part. The camera moves through Springfield. The characters converge on the house from various directions. And they land on the couch, together, in the living room, in front of the television. The couch gag is the show's most consistent structural element. It has varied its execution in hundreds of ways across the show's run, sometimes briefly, sometimes elaborately, sometimes as a simple comedic beat, and sometimes as an extended sequence that functions as a short film unto itself. Guest animators have done it. Major directors have contributed versions of it. The show has invited outside artists to reinterpret it in their own visual languages. But the structure never changes. The family converges. They land on the couch. They are together. This is what ritual is. A repeated action that accumulates meaning through its repetition, that becomes more than the sum of its literal elements because of the weight of all the previous times it has been performed. The couch gag is Springfield's ritual, the show's ceremonial acknowledgement that another episode is beginning. Another cycle of the loop is starting. The family is together, and the story is resuming. Under the coma theory, the couch gag takes on a specific emotional quality. Every episode begins with the family reaching the couch together, because the dreaming mind's deepest need is to see that convergence, to confirm it, to start from the baseline of everyone present and together before the episode's events take the family in different directions. Homer's dream needs to begin every cycle with proof that the family is intact. They converge, they land, they are together. And then the episode begins, and the loop runs. And at the end they are together again, because the loop always brings them back, because the dream always returns them to each other, because the couch is where Springfield's most important truth lives. The family is there. The family is always there. Whatever else the episode does, whatever else Springfield produces, the family survives it and lands together at the end. That's the promise the show has been making for 36 years. Not that everything will be fine. Not that Springfield will be fixed, or burns will be stopped, or the contamination will be addressed, or the mysteries will be solved, but that the family will be there, on the couch, together. At the end of every episode, at the end of every cycle, at the end of whatever the loop runs through this time, they land. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, watching television, in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in Springfield, in the loop, where they will always be, because that is what Springfield is for, not for solving, not for escaping, not for understanding in the sense of understanding something you can then put down, for returning to, night after night, episode after episode, season after season, for as long as the dream holds and the loop spins and the couch is there waiting. You turn on the television. The clouds part. The camera moves through Springfield. You're home. End. Extended section. Every character as a mirror. What Springfield reflects. There is a reason every major character in Springfield maps onto something recognizable in the people watching the show, something that goes deeper than good writing or memorable voice performances or the accumulated weight of decades of storytelling. The reason is that Springfield's characters were designed to function as mirrors, as specific reflections of specific things that the audience carries, and the show has maintained and deepened those reflective qualities across 36 years of episodes. Homer is the mirror for aspiration that has been redirected. He wanted things. He still wants things, in the inarticulate way that damaged wanting expresses itself, in the form of immediate pleasures and short-term satisfactions, and the specific comfort of the couch, and the beer, and the television, and the family gathered around him. He wanted more than that once. The show has shown you the more than that version of Homer, in the crayon episode, in glimpses of what he could have been, in the moments where the fog lifts enough for him to see the distance between what he is and what he might have been. The more than that Homer is still in there. He chose to cover him up, but he's in there. People watch Homer and recognize the redirection, the wanting that got smaller and more manageable, the horizon that stopped feeling like a horizon and started feeling like a wall, the comfort that became a substitute for the aspiration rather than a rest stop on the way to it. They recognize it, and they laugh, because the recognition is painful enough that laughing is the only comfortable response to it. Marge is the mirror for labor that goes unacknowledged. She keeps everything running. She manages the emotional life of a household that would collapse without her management. She suppresses what she needs to suppress, expresses what she needs to express, maintains the stability that makes everyone else's chaos navigable. She does this continuously, without being asked, without receiving the systematic recognition that would match the systematic nature of her contribution. And she loves her family with a genuineness that makes the labor worth it to her most of the time, which is both the truth and the thing that makes the truth more complicated. People watch Marge and recognize the labor. The way the work of maintaining a household and a family and a relationship is both real and invisible. The way loving someone and doing the work of loving them can coexist with a weariness that the love doesn't erase. They recognize it and they feel seen in a way that television rarely delivers, because the show doesn't moralize about Marge's situation or resolve it tidily. It just depicts it with enough specificity that the recognition is precise. Bart is the mirror for the rebellion that never quite found its target. He resists. He resists everything. He resists authority and expectation and the future that Springfield wants to sort him into. But the resistance is unorganized and mostly ineffective, and tends to produce consequences that fall on Bart rather than on the systems he's resisting. He is the kid who knows something is wrong without having the language or the tools to address what it is. He acts out because acting out is the only response available to him. People watch Bart and recognize the resistance without direction, the anger at something they can't quite name, the defiance that expressed itself in the wrong places because the right places were too large or too abstract or too well defended to hit effectively. They recognize it, and they feel, alongside the recognition, the specific tenderness that you feel toward a version of yourself that was fighting very hard and didn't have quite what it needed to win. Lisa is the mirror for the intelligence that costs too much. She knows things. She sees things clearly. She articulates what she sees with precision and conviction, and the specific energy of someone for whom understanding and caring are the same action. And she is consistently, systematically, patiently ignored. Not cruelly. Springfield doesn't treat Lisa cruelly. It treats her with the specific kindness of people who recognize that you have a gift they can't use and are trying to be gentle about declining it. People watch Lisa and recognize the cost. The specific loneliness of seeing clearly in a context that doesn't value the clarity. The exhaustion of caring about things that the people around you have decided not to care about. The way intelligence without community becomes its own kind of trap. They recognize it and they feel something that is partly sympathy and partly grief, and partly the specific solidarity of knowing that someone else experienced this too, even if that someone else is an 8-year-old fictional cartoon child who plays the saxophone. And Maggie is the mirror for the self that nobody sees. The part that watches everything and processes everything and holds everything that can't be said, for whatever reasons can't be said. The intelligence behind the silence. The capability behind the passive presentation. The thing that is fully present and fully aware and simply waiting for the right moment, for the right opening, for the conditions that will make speaking and acting and revealing worth the exposure. People watch Maggie and recognize the hidden self, the version of themselves that exists in the gap between what they present and what they actually are. The watching and the processing and the waiting. The choice, sometimes, to not reveal what you know because the knowing is more powerful when it stays concealed. Springfield's characters are mirrors because they were built as mirrors. And the show has run long enough that the reflections have accumulated depth, have become more detailed and more specific, and more truthful through the simple accumulation of time and episodes and the ongoing presence of these characters in the cultural life of everyone who has watched them. You don't just watch The Simpsons. You see yourself in it, in one character or another, in one moment or another, across one season or another. You see something true being depicted, and the truth of the depiction creates the recognition, and the recognition creates the bond that brings you back. That's the final mystery of Springfield. Not the radiation or the coma or who shot Burns or where the town is on the map or why nobody ages. The final mystery is why it works. Why 36 years of a cartoon family in an impossible town continues to generate genuine recognition and genuine emotion in millions of people who have spent their entire adult lives watching it. And the answer is that Springfield works because it is honest about the things that American culture mostly isn't. About what it costs to be ordinary in a system designed for extraordinary outcomes. About what it costs to love people who are damaged and to be loved by them in return. About what happens to intelligence when it exists in an environment that can't use it. about what happens to people when the conditions of their lives are shaped by forces too large and too entrenched to effectively challenge, about the loops that hold us, about why we maintain them, about what we would have to look at directly if we stopped. Springfield is honest about all of this, in jokes and running gags and continuity errors and theories that the show introduces and never resolves, and storylines that build toward implications and then pull back before the implications fully land. It says the thing it can't quite say, in the way that art says things that direct statement can't carry. And across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, the accumulated weight of all those almost said things has built something that functions, for the people who have watched it that long, as a genuine part of their interior landscape. Springfield is in us now. It's been in us since we first sat down in front of it, whenever that was, whatever age we were, whatever version of the show we first encountered. The loop runs. The family is on the couch. The television is on. And the show, as it always does, continues.